There are stories a man carries for the rest of his life not because they are extraordinary in the telling, but because they changed the shape of everything that came after. The story of James Aldrich Montfort, 6th Duke of Ravemore, is one of those. I was there for most of it. I watched it happen the way you watch a storm gather over the moors, gradually, then all at once. And I have spent the better part of 30 years failing to describe it to anyone's satisfaction, including my own. My name is Edmund Ware. Lord Edmund, if you require titles, though at my age they feel more like furniture than identity. I am the man who stood at James Montfort's left side when he was 17, and every boy at Aldenmere Grammar was afraid of him. I am the man who drank with him through 3 continental tour and 2 near duels. I am the man who stood beside him in the fields of Ravemore on winter mornings when the frost lay an inch deep and neither of us could see the horse's breath for how cold it was. And we talked about absolutely nothing of consequence for hours because the talking was the thing, not the subject. I am the man who, on the morning of the 14th of January, 1822, stood in the vestry of St. Aldrich's Cathedral in the center of Aldenmere and told a very composed and quietly devastated young woman that the Duke of Ravemore would not be coming. And I am the man who, in the 30 years since that morning, has been asked to account for what happened more times than I can precisely remember. Why did he do it? What was he thinking? How could a man of his position, his promise, his impeccable record of doing everything correctly, how could he stand up on his wedding morning and simply leave? I will tell you all of it, as carefully and as honestly as I am able, because it deserves to be told honestly. Not as a scandal and not as a romance, though it is both of those things. As a story about what happens when a man who has organized his entire existence around duty and propriety encounters a woman who reminds him, with no particular intention of doing so, that he is alive. Her name was Verity Callum. She was a seamstress. She had no title, no family fortune, no social position to speak of, and no idea, when she arrived at Ravemore Hall in the 3rd week of October, carrying her tools and her measuring tape and her professional composure like armor, that the Duke of Ravemore was going to upend his entire life for her. For that matter, neither did he. Let me begin at the proper beginning, because the beginning matters. Every consequence in this story grew out of things that were established months before anyone recognized they were being established, and I want to be careful not to compress what took time to grow into something that looks simpler in retrospect than it was in the living of it. James Aldrich Montfort came into the Ravemore dukedom at the age of 22, when his father died of a fever that should not have killed a man of 48 but did, as these things sometimes do without waiting for permission. He was the only son. There were 2 sisters, both already married and settled in their own households, and a mother who was a formidable woman of deep feeling who had spent the 22 years of James's life preparing him for exactly this moment, and who was, when the moment arrived, less prepared for it than she had thought she would be. The preparation and the reality of a thing, as James told me once, are always at some distance from each other. The preparation for grief is not the same as grief. The preparation for responsibility is not the same as the weight of it on your actual shoulders. He managed it well. That is what I want you to understand about James before I tell you anything else. He was an exceptional man in the practical sense, the sense that concerns the running of things and the keeping of obligations and the knowing of what was required. He knew Ravemore Hall the way a surgeon knows a body, its structure, its systems, its weaknesses, the places where past decisions had stored up future costs. He had been taught by his father, who had been taught by his, and the knowledge was deep and practical and not given to sentiment. The estate in 1821 was larger than it had been in his grandfather's time, and rather better organized than it had been in his father's, and this was a tribute to James's particular quality of mind, which was organized without being cold, thorough without being rigid, and capable of caring about the right things in the right order. He was also, and this is a thing I say with the affection of 30 years' friendship, he was also a man who had, by the time this story begins, somewhat miscalculated the costs of a life organized entirely around obligation. Not dramatically. Not in any way that showed, or that he acknowledged, or that anyone in the county would have been able to put a finger on. But I knew him and I watched him, and I could see in the way he managed his evenings, the precision of the routine, the hours in the library with the accounts, the long walks in the park taken alone with the purposefulness of a man who needs the exercise and is not particularly seeking the pleasure of it, something that was not quite unhappiness, but was its close neighbor. The house was beautifully maintained and not particularly lived in. The rooms were in excellent order and did not feel as if anyone had recently sat in them without a reason. Ravemore Hall worked perfectly. Ravemore Hall was not warm. I had been thinking this, on and off, for about 3 years before October 1821. I had not said it to James because saying things like this to James was an exercise in architectural precision. You had to approach from the correct angle at the correct moment, or the door simply was not there. I had it catalogued as one of the things I needed to get around to before we were both old men, and I had left it there, in the drawer where you put things that matter, but that you do not yet know how to say. The autumn of 1821 was the kind of autumn that makes England look like a painting someone has had the good taste not to varnish. The oaks on the Ravemore parkland went amber and bronze, the mornings came in with frost on the grass, and the cathedral city of Aldenmere settled into the particular satisfied quiet of a place that has seen 300 years of autumns and expects 300 more. I rode out to Ravemore Hall in the first week of October because James had written asking me to come, which he did not do unless something had happened or something was about to. I found him in the library, which was where he usually was when he was thinking hard enough that he wanted walls around him. He was standing at the long window looking out at the park, and he had the particular stillness about him that I had learned to read as contained disturbance. Not agitation exactly, more like a man holding something carefully because he knows it might break. I helped myself to the decanter on the sideboard and waited. This was how we had always operated. He did not need me to speak. He needed me to be present, which is a different thing and a more considerable one than it sounds. "My mother has written," he said, without turning from the window. "She writes every fortnight," I said. "Has since you were 14. This letter was different. He turned then, and I saw it in his face, not grief, not anger, but the expression of a man who has received news that confirms something he already suspected and did not want confirmed. "She is asking whether I intend to make an offer to Lady Cecilia Ashfield before the new year." I knew the name, of course. All of Aldenmere knew the name. Lady Cecilia was the eldest daughter of Lord Morven, Earl of Ashfield, a family of considerable standing, impeccable lineage, and exactly the kind of connections that James's mother had been quietly, persistently advocating for since James came into the dukedom. Lady Cecilia was 23, accomplished in every drawing-room art, beautiful in the precise, cool way of a woman who has been told about her beauty so often that she has learned to hold it as a professional asset. I had met her at 2 assemblies and a country house party, and I had found her entirely pleasant and entirely opaque, like a room that has been beautifully furnished and never once lived in. She said the right thing at the right moment with the practiced ease of a woman who has been trained to say it. She was kind, I believed, in the abstract way of a person who had never been required to be kind concretely. She had opinions, but expressed them with such careful qualification that they became more like reported opinions than actual ones. She was exactly the kind of woman who would make exactly the kind of duchess who was expected of Ravemore, and every time I tried to think of her and James in the same room together, I found myself unable to produce any particular warmth. "What will you tell her?" I asked. "That I will call on Morven before Christmas." I turned the glass in my hands. "And that is what you want." He was quiet for a moment that stretched longer than I expected. Then, "What I want," he said carefully, "is to do my duty to the estate, to my family's name, and to the obligations that came with the title. What I want is to give my mother peace of mind on this particular subject before she works herself into a genuine decline. What I want is to stop having this conversation in my own head every time I walk through the family wing and see the portraits of my father and grandfather looking down at me, as if asking whether I intend to let the line die out. That," I said, "is an excellent description of what you feel is required of you. I notice it is not an answer to my question." He made a short sound that was almost a laugh. "No," he agreed, "it is not." He turned back to the window. I drank my brandy and did not press him, because there are things a man of James Montfort's particular formation cannot be pressed about. Things that have been walled over so long that the wall has become load-bearing, and if you chip at it carelessly, the ceiling comes down. What I understood, standing in that library in October 1821, was that James had decided. The deciding was behind him. What was ahead was the execution of the decision, and all of its consequences, and a question he had apparently chosen not to ask himself with too much specificity. "Very well," I said after a while. "Congratulations in advance." He gave me a look. "Don't be sardonic." "I am never sardonic, I am precise." I set down my glass. "Shall I stay for the week?" "If you would," he said. I stayed for 3. The engagement was announced at a small dinner at Morven House in November, attended by precisely the people it needed to be attended by, the Ashfield family connections, a handful of Lord Morven's political allies, James's mother the Dowager Duchess, and myself, in my capacity as James's oldest friend, and the man he apparently trusted to give him a signal nod across the table if the conversation grew unendurable. Lady Cecilia received the announcement with the expression of a woman who had been expecting it, and who found the expectation confirmed pleasant rather than thrilling. James was correct and gracious, and said all the right things. Lord Morven made a brief speech that touched the appropriate points in the appropriate order. The Dowager was magnificent in her satisfaction and pressed James's hand with a warmth that conveyed both love and a considerable measure of relief. I drank 2 glasses of excellent claret, and watched the whole proceeding with the slightly vertiginous feeling of a man who is not sure whether he is watching something go right or something go wrong, and cannot quite tell them apart from the inside. Afterward, in the carriage back to Ravemore Hall, James did not speak for the better part of an hour. I did not speak either. There are silences that are simply weather, and this was one of those. The wedding was set for the 14th of January, early enough in the new year that the Ashfield connections could attend before the spring session called them to London, late enough that the trousseau and the arrangements could be made with some reasonable degree of dignity rather than haste. The church was St. Aldrich's Cathedral in the center of Aldenmere, where 6 generations of Montforts had been married and buried and confirmed in the faith, and whose stone arches had witnessed enough Ravemore business that the dean had developed a particular expression of combined reverence and familiarity when dealing with the family. It was Lady Cecilia's mother, Lady Morven, who engaged the seamstress. She did it through a recommendation from Mrs. Farquhar Sims, who had used the woman for her own daughter's wedding the previous spring, and could not say enough about the precision of the work and the professionalism of the approach. "She is not fashionable," Lady Morven told the Dowager, which the Dowager understood to mean affordable and excellent. The Dowager had very clear ideas about the difference between fashionable excess and genuine craft. The recommendation included the further information that the gown produced for the Farquhar Sims wedding had been, without question, the most discussed piece of work at that occasion, and not only because of the girl wearing it. The construction was said to be remarkable, the kind that holds up, that wears well, that does not simply look fine at a single charged moment, but serves the person inside it across all the moments of a long and difficult day. And so a note was sent to Milsom Lane, Aldenmere, to a workshop whose sign read simply CALLUM, alterations and commissions, and an appointment was made. And on the 21st of October, a woman arrived at Ravemore Hall with a leather satchel and a measuring tape looped over one shoulder. I was standing near the servants' entrance when she arrived, because I had been out walking the grounds and had come in through the kitchen yard to avoid the mud-ridden formal approach. I was therefore the first person of the household to encounter Miss Verity Callum, and I am pleased to report that my first impression was favorable. She was perhaps 25, with dark hair pinned neatly under a plain bonnet and eyes that were neither particularly striking in color nor small in expression. They were the kind of eyes that take in everything and give back only what they choose to. She was modestly dressed in the way of someone who takes care to present herself well on a considered budget. A dark blue wool coat, good boots, a plain brown glove on the hand not occupied by the satchel. She held herself with the particular uprightness of a person who has learned that posture is the one thing that costs nothing and concedes nothing, and she knocked at the servants' entrance with 3 clean, unhurried knocks, without looking around to see whether anyone was watching. "Miss Callum," I said. Yes, she did not add Lord or your lordship because she did not know who I was. I found this immediately refreshing. "I have an appointment with Mrs. Darrow." "She is expecting you," I said, and held the door. She gave me a glance that assessed and categorized in about half a second. She was wondering, I think, whether I was a senior servant or a family guest, and she chose to treat me as the latter on the grounds that only a guest would hold a door rather than announce himself. "Thank you," she said, and went in. That was my introduction to Verity Callum. It was, in retrospect, exactly her. The economy of it. The assessing glance, the polite word, and then the business of why she was there. She was not cold. She was not unfriendly. She was simply a person for whom efficiency and precision were native, and for whom unnecessary performance of any kind was not particularly interesting. Mrs. Darrow showed her the sewing room on the first floor, a long, light room with south-facing windows that had belonged to James's grandmother, who had been an embroiderer of considerable skill, and showed her the long gallery, which Verity would be permitted to use for laying out the larger pieces, and showed her the servants' dining room where she would take her meals, and gave her the general shape of the household's arrangements. Verity asked 3 questions, each of which was relevant and efficiently phrased, noted the answers in a small leather notebook she produced from the satchel, and thanked Mrs. Darrow with a warmth that was genuine without being effusive. That was the way she moved through the world, as far as I could observe in those early weeks, exactly what the situation required, neither more nor less. James met her 3 days later, and his introduction was even less consequential. He came into the morning room while she was taking Lady Cecilia's measurements. Lady Cecilia had traveled to Ravemore for the initial consultation, and he stopped in the doorway with the expression of a man who has walked into the wrong room and is calculating the least disruptive exit. Verity Callum was kneeling on the floor with a length of pale silk across her forearms, pinning a hemline with the focused attention of someone diffusing a mechanism. She was speaking quietly to Lady Cecilia as she worked, explaining something about the fall of the fabric and the adjustment she was making, and she did not look up. Lady Cecilia, who had been holding very still with the long practice of a woman accustomed to fittings, said, "James, you do not need to be here." "I was looking for Ware," he said. "Lord Ware is in the library." "Thank you." He looked for a moment at the tableau, his intended, the silk, the kneeling woman with the pins, and then at Verity Callum, who still had not looked up, and said, with the slightly more formal politeness he defaulted to with people he did not know, "I beg your pardon for the interruption." Verity Callum said, without looking up, in the tone of a person who is doing something that requires the majority of her attention and can only spare the minimum, "If you could close the door as you go, Your Grace. The draft from the hall makes the silk behave unpredictably, and I have just got this hem level." He blinked. This was not the response he was accustomed to. Most people, on being noticed by the Duke of Ravemore, either fell over themselves with deference or became very careful and formal. Verity Callum had simply identified a problem and requested a solution. He closed the door. I know this because Lady Cecilia told me about it afterward, with the slightly amused expression she sometimes wore when James behaved in ways she found unexpected. "She spoke to him as if he were a footman who had left a window open," she said, "and he closed the door." "Did that bother you?" I asked. "Not at all," she said, and there was something in her voice, not annoyance precisely, but the absence of the spark one might expect when a woman speaks of how her future husband responded to someone else's calm authority. The trousseau commission was a large one: the bridal gown, 2 traveling costumes, an evening gown, and 4-day dresses, all to be completed before the wedding in January. And it required Verity Callum to attend at Ravemore Hall on 3 to 4 days of each week through November and into December. For roughly 11 weeks, she became a regular presence in the household, arriving at 9, working through the afternoon in the sewing room or the long gallery as the work required, taking her meals with the upper servants, departing before the dinner hour unless the light and the work conspired to keep her later. She was, by all accounts, a quiet and professional presence. The footmen liked her because she said thank you and meant it and knew all their names by the 2nd week. The housekeeper respected her because she left every room she worked in exactly as she had found it, never asked for more than she needed, and had the professional habit of being precisely where she said she would be at the time she said she would be there. The lady's maid was in some awe of her because of what she could do with 12 yards of silk, and a set of opinions about cut that were expressed without apology and proved, on each occasion, to be correct. James encountered her occasionally. This was inevitable given the size of the commission and the rooms required. When Verity needed space to lay out the larger pieces, she used the long gallery with the housekeeper's permission, the floor cleared of furniture. James passed through both the sewing room and the gallery in the ordinary course of a day in his own house. He did not, to my knowledge, seek her out. What happened instead was more gradual, and therefore more dangerous. I was at Ravemore for the first 2 weeks of November, and during that period I noticed something that I would not have been able to articulate precisely at the time. James, who was not a man given to altering his routines, had begun in small ways to alter his routines. He took his morning coffee in the morning room rather than the breakfast room, because the morning room was at the end of the corridor that led to the first floor. He began walking the long gallery before dinner, which he had not done since his father's time, and which he had previously described to me as a waste of 40 paces. He spent time in the library less often in the late afternoon and more often in the late morning, which coincided with the hours Verity Callum sometimes worked in the sewing room just above. He asked Mrs. Darrow, once, whether the commission was proceeding satisfactorily. Mrs. Darrow found this mildly surprising and told him that the commission was proceeding exceptionally well. He said, "Good," and went back to his library. None of this was dramatic. None of it was something I could have pointed at and said, "Look, there is a man falling in love." It was more like watching a river shift its banks by a foot, the change only visible if you knew where the banks had been before. The first real conversation I observed between them happened on the 12th of November, by accident on both sides. I had gone up to the library after dinner to fetch a book I had left there, and I came down to find the first-floor corridor lit by a single lamp from the sewing room, whose door stood an inch open. James was standing in the doorway. He was not going in. He was standing with one hand on the door frame, and Verity Callum was inside, seated at the long table with a piece of work before her, and they were talking. I stopped at the top of the stairs, because interrupting seemed wrong and retreating seemed cowardly, and I stood there in the shadows and listened. She was explaining something about the second evening gown, the blue-green silk that Lady Cecilia had specified for the first Ravemore Christmas dinner after the wedding. She was explaining why the cut she had chosen differed from the one Lady Cecilia had originally requested. The line she wanted, she said, would have required her to stand quite still all evening to look her best. This line will hold through movement. She will be at a dinner table, not a portrait sitting. She will need to turn and reach and lean and rise, and the gown must hold through all of it without pulling or creasing. So I have adjusted the cut in the shoulder, and the side seam and the back pleat. "You chose differently from what you were asked," James said, not accusingly. He was interested. I could hear it, the tone he used when he was genuinely curious about something, which I knew because he used it rarely. He was a man who had spent most of his life already knowing what he thought about most things. The occasions when he encountered something that genuinely interested him had a particular quality. "Within the specification," Verity said, and her hands moved as she spoke. I could hear the small sounds of work in progress. "The color, the fabric, and the general silhouette are exactly what Lady Cecilia described. I have adjusted the cut in ways that she will not notice but will feel. The gown will serve her better. And you did not ask permission for the adjustment. If I asked permission for every professional judgment I made, I would spend more time asking than doing. If there is something that does not suit, I can rework it." "There is nothing that does not suit," he said. "I am trying to understand the principle." A pause, the sound of scissors on silk carefully. "The principle," she said, "is that the person who wears the thing is more important than the person who ordered it. The specification comes from the latter, but the garment ultimately serves the former. If the specification and the service are in any conflict, the service wins. Provided I stay within the terms of what I was asked, which I always do. And if they are not in conflict, then there is nothing to decide. Then I simply do what was asked to the best standard I can achieve, which is most of the time." "But you noticed that they were in conflict here." "Yes," she said. "And resolved it in favor of the person who wears the thing." "Always," she said. Another pause, longer this time. "That is an interesting way to think about your work," James said. "It is the only way I know how to do it," she said, simply. Not defensive, not performing, not inviting further comment, just a fact about herself, stated the way you state the color of a thing. I could hear in her voice the complete absence of self-consciousness that I was coming to understand was one of her most distinctive qualities. She had no idea that what she had just said was the most honest thing spoken in Ravemore Hall in some time. She was simply answering a question. She had not organized her response for an audience. It was true, and so she said it, and that was all. I think James felt it too. Because there was a silence after that, and then he said, quietly, almost to himself, "That is a better principle than most." "Forgive me," she said, and her voice had shifted almost imperceptibly. She had heard something in his tone, I think, and was not sure what to do with it. "I have kept you standing in the doorway." I did not realize how late it had become. "You have not kept me," he said. "I stopped because the light was on. Good night, Miss Callum." "Good night, Your Grace." I went back upstairs for the book I had technically gone to fetch. I stood in the dark library for several minutes, not quite thinking anything in particular, and then I went back to my room and sat at my desk for a while and thought in a more organized way, and what I thought was, this situation has a character I recognize, and I do not yet know what to do with what I recognize. I went home to Derbyshire in the 3rd week of November and stayed there for 10 days. By the time I came back to Aldenmuir in early December, the wedding preparations had begun to accelerate. Verity Callum was there when I arrived, in the sewing room, surrounded by the various pieces of the trousseau at various stages of completion. I stopped to speak to her because I had liked her, and because I had been thinking about her in an oblique way for the better part of 10 days. "How is the bridal gown coming?" I asked. She looked up. She remembered me from October, I could see the recognition, but she was still not sure exactly who I was, which continued to be something I found unreasonably charming. "Nearly finished," she said. "The bodice is complete and the overskirt is nearly done. I have the final fitting with Lady Cecilia to manage, and then it will be ready." "And what are you working on at this moment?" She held up a piece of pale gold fabric. "The second traveling costume. There is a panel that has gone slightly off grain. The fabric was mislaid while I was away last week and did not lie flat, and it has developed a pull that will show under certain lights." She tilted the fabric so I could see the near-imperceptible distortion in the weave. "Most people would not notice." "But you notice." "I always notice," she said, without any particular pride in it. "It is not a virtue, it is simply how I see." I sat down in the chair by the window. "May I ask you something?" She gave me the assessing look. "You may ask." "What do you make of Ravemore Hall?" I said. She was quiet for a moment, her hands still moving on the fabric. "It is a beautiful house," she said. "Very good bones. The proportions are honest. The rooms are the right size for what they contain. The ceilings are the right height for the rooms, and it does not try to be something it is not. That is rarer than people think. A great many large houses mistake scale for elegance and end up with neither. And," she looked at me with a brief directness, "and it is a lonely house. I do not say this as a criticism of the way it is run. The housekeeper is exceptional and everything is well managed. I say it as an observation of something in the quality of certain rooms, the ones not being used for the preparations. They are very quiet, not the quiet of rooms that are resting between uses. The quiet of rooms that have not recently been wanted. A happy house has a different quality of quiet. A happy house has a quality of sound. People crossing rooms to find each other, doors left open because they expect to be followed. Even between the active hours, you can feel the memory of it. This house has very good order and very little of that memory." She paused. "I am speaking too freely. It is not my place." "No," I said. "Please continue. I am asking in earnest." She held the fabric up briefly against the light from the window. "I think it is the kind of house that could change. It has the right materials. The structure is sound and the rooms are fine and the grounds are remarkable. What it wants is the right arrangement of circumstances." She set the fabric down. "Houses reflect what happens in them. This one reflects a long time of things being very well managed and not very warm." I looked at her for a moment. She was already back to the fabric, her hands moving with patient focus. "Lord Edmund where?" I said. She looked up. "My name," I said, "in case you needed it." She gave a very small smile, the first smile I had seen from her that was not the professional courtesy kind. "I did not like to ask," she said. December came in cold and bright. The hall was increasingly occupied with the machinery of the approaching wedding. The dowager arrived from Bath with her companion and her opinions. Lady Cecilia came twice more for fittings, and on both occasions James was elsewhere. Whether this was coincidence or design on his part, I could not tell, though I had begun to suspect design. What I could tell was this: he was sleeping poorly. I knew this because I was a light sleeper myself, and the sound of footsteps in the long gallery at 2 in the morning was not the kind of thing you missed when you were in the guest wing just above. 3 nights in a row I heard him. The 4th night he went further, down the main stairs and through the hall below, and I lay in the dark and listened to the silence that followed and did not get up because I did not know what I would say. I mentioned it once, carefully, over breakfast. "You are walking the gallery at night," I said. "I have always walked at night when I cannot sleep," he said. "You slept perfectly well through all of October." He looked at me and I looked back and he said, "What are you suggesting, Edmund?" "Nothing," I said. "I am recording an observation. Sleep is important for a man facing a large event." He held my gaze for another second. Then he looked away. "Thank you for the counsel," he said in his flattest tone, which meant the subject was closed. I let it be closed. I had, in December, a conversation with Lady Cecilia that I have thought about many times in the years since. It was at the second fitting, which I was not attending but walked past. The morning room door was open, and she and Verity were discussing the neckline of the bridal gown, and I stopped in the corridor for a moment before continuing. On my way back from the library an hour later, Lady Cecilia was in the hall pulling on her gloves, preparing to leave. I walked with her to the door as courtesy required, and as we walked she said, without particular preamble, "Miss Callum is a remarkable woman." "She is," I agreed. She told me today that the neckline I requested would not work with the way I tend to hold my head when I am nervous, and that she had changed it to correct for this. Lady Cecilia pulled the second glove on with a precise tug. She said, "I have noticed that when you are in company and somewhat uncertain, you tip your chin down slightly, and this neckline will make that visible in a way that the alternative will not." I thought she was very perceptive. "She sees everything," I said. Lady Cecilia looked at me briefly. "Yes," she said, "I have noticed that too." A pause, then, "Lord Ware, do you know James well?" "I have known him since we were 17, I said. "Is he—" She stopped. She was looking at the door, and there was something in her profile in that moment that was not the public, polished Lady Cecilia, but something more real and more uncertain underneath. "Is he a man who is, in general, content?" I looked at her. The question was not what I expected. "He is," I said slowly, "a man who has a very thorough understanding of what is required of him, and who meets those requirements with exceptional care." She looked at me. I could see her processing the negative space in what I had said. "I see," she said. After a moment, "Thank you, Lord Ware." She went to the carriage. I stood at the door of Ravemore Hall and watched it pull away, and thought that Lady Cecilia Ashfield was a considerably more perceptive woman than she was generally given credit for. The conversation that unmade everything happened on the 18th of December. I know the date because I wrote it in my journal that night in the sort of compact, terse way you write things when you are not sure what they mean but feel that they should be recorded. I wrote 18 December, long gallery, candles. They did not know I was there. I believe this is trouble of the significant kind. It was late past 9 o'clock, and I had been playing cards with the Dowager and her companion and losing badly. I excused myself at 9:30 and went toward the stairs, intending to go up to my room. The long gallery was dark except for light coming from its far end, where the south windows overlooked the park. Someone had placed a branch of candles on the windowsill. Verity Callum, I realized. The hall porter had mentioned she was working late on some final adjustments to the bridal gown, which Lady Cecilia needed to take with her when she returned to Morven House the following morning. The gown was spread on the long table that Mrs. Darrow had set up at the gallery's far end, a sweep of ivory silk that caught the candle light and made the whole end of the gallery glow softly, like the interior of a lamp. James was there. He was standing near the table with his hands behind his back, looking at the gown, and Verity Callum was standing on the other side of the table looking at him. They were not speaking. There was something in the silence that made me stop at the gallery's entrance and not go in. The silence lasted perhaps another 30 seconds. Then she said, "Is there something you needed, Your Grace?" "No," he said. He looked up from the gown. "I came past and the light was on." The echo of that, the same words he had used in November, the same explanation must have reached her too, because she was quiet for a moment in a way that was slightly different from her usual quiet. Then, "The work is nearly finished. I will be gone within the hour." "There is no need to hurry," he said. Another silence, different from the ones I had heard between them before. This one had weight to it. "It is a beautiful piece of work," he said of the gown. "Thank you," she said. "Lady Cecilia will look very fine in it." Something in his voice when he said Lady Cecilia's name. Not wrong, it was not wrong, but it had the quality of a recitation, the careful performance of a man saying something correct rather than something true. "She will," Verity said, and then after a pause that was longer than professional courtesy required in a different tone, "Your Grace," measured, "may I ask, are you well?" He looked at her, "Perfectly well." "Why do you ask?" "Because you have come past this room," she said, "6 times in the past 3 weeks, always late in the evening, always when the light was on. I do not say this to be impertinent. I say it because it has seemed to me that something was not wrong precisely, unsettled." The silence after that was the longest one yet. "You have been counting," he said finally. "I notice things," she said. "It is, as I said to Lord Ware, my job, or rather it is a habit of my job that has become general. I notice when things do not quite fit." "And something does not quite fit," he said. She was quiet. When she spoke, her voice was careful with the carefulness of someone who is aware that they are in territory where carelessness would be wrong. "I should not say that." "Why not?" "Because it is not my place. I am here to complete a commission, and the commission is almost done, and then I will not be here, and whatever does or does not fit in this house is not something I have any right to an opinion on." "I am asking for your opinion," he said. Another pause. "There is something," she said carefully. "I can say it as a thing I observe without any inference about what it means." A pause. "The house that this gown was commissioned for and the man who commissioned it do not feel quite like the same thing. It is a beautiful house and a remarkable man, and the gown is well made and all the pieces are the correct ones. But they do not quite, the fit is not." She stopped. "I am speaking entirely too freely." "You are speaking honestly," he said. "There is a difference." A long silence. Outside, the park was dark, and a light wind moved through the old oaks, and the candles in the gallery shifted in a draught and steadied again. "My father died when I was 11, James said suddenly, as if the words had been waiting and had simply come. "He was a man who understood how everything worked, but he was a man who laughed, not loudly, quietly. The kind of laugh that you only hear if you are close to someone. I have not heard that laugh in this house since he died." He stopped. He looked at the gown. "Forgive me, I do not generally speak of that." "No," she said. "I did not imagine you would." She had not moved. She was still standing on the other side of the table, her hands resting lightly on the edge of it, and her voice was steady with the steadiness of someone who is being careful without being cold. "I will not repeat it," she said. "I know you won't," he said. And then there was a silence between them that was different from all the others. Not empty, full. Full of something that neither of them had said and both of them could feel, and I, standing at the far end of the gallery in the dark, could feel it too, like the change in air pressure before a storm breaks. It lasted only a moment. Then he said very quietly, "Good night, Miss Callum." "Good night, Your Grace." He walked past me in the dark, his steps on the stone floor careful and deliberate, the steps of a man who is keeping himself very controlled. I stood still until he had gone. Then I looked back at the far end of the gallery, where Verity Callum was still standing by the gown in the candlelight, her hands flat on the table edge, her face turned toward where he had been. Her expression was one I have not forgotten in 30 years. It was not longing, quite. It was something quieter than longing and more honest, the expression of someone who has recognized something they did not expect to recognize, and who is already calculating what it will cost. The expression of a very clear-eyed person who has just seen something that they know they should not see and cannot unknow, and who is not, for all their clear-eyedness, entirely sure they are sorry. Then she straightened her shoulders, picked up her scissors, and went back to work. She delivered the bridal gown to Morven House on the 21st of December, on the back of a cart driven by her assistant, and was thanked by Lady Morven with a bank draft and the information that the wedding garments had been received with satisfaction. She wrote a note to Mrs. Darrow at Ravemore Hall thanking her for the hospitality and wishing the household well in the season ahead. Brief, professional, and entirely what you would expect from a woman of her position and discretion. There was no note to James. There was no reason there should have been. The commission was concluded, the work was done, and they were not connected by any thread of business or society that would make a note appropriate. She was a seamstress. He was the Duke of Ravemore, 4 weeks from his wedding. Whatever the long gallery and its candlelight had held between them, it was not something either of them was in a position to name. James received no note. He did not mention her name. He also stopped sleeping entirely, which I know because I heard him in the gallery every night between the 22nd of December and the 6th of January, and because at breakfast his eyes had the particular quality of eyes that have been open in the dark for too many hours. Christmas came and went at the hall with the Dowager and myself, and a pair of cousins who appeared for the occasion and ate a great deal, and contributed nothing to any conversation that could not have been equally well served by a pair of decorative urns. Lady Cecilia was at Morven House with her family. James and I sat with the Dowager through the Christmas dinner and talked about the things families talk about at Christmas: the estate, the season, some cousins at a remove who had done something noteworthy in the peninsula, the Dowager's plans for the spring. James was present and appropriate and entirely elsewhere in his head. The evenings were harder to watch. He sat in the library with accounts he was not reading or with books open to pages that did not turn. He poured brandy that went untouched in the glass for an hour and then was drunk all at once as if he had suddenly remembered it was there. He stood at windows in the dark. Once, passing the music room, I heard him lift the cover of the pianoforte, a thing he had not done in years, and then close it again without playing. After dinner on the 26th of December, when the Dowager had retired and the cousins had found their card game, James and I sat in the library with the fire and the brandy and the dark outside the window. And I waited, because I knew that if there was going to be a conversation it would happen here, in this room, in the habit of 30 years. He said, "Edmund." "Yes," I said. A long pause. He turned his glass in his hands. The fire shifted. If a man were to discover, rather late in a particular process, that he had made a significant error in judgment, what would you consider his options to be? I was quiet for a moment. "That would depend considerably," I said, "on how large an error and how late in the process." "Very late," he said, "and the error—" He stopped. He picked up his glass and put it down again without drinking. "It is not an error about the person," he said carefully. "Lady Cecilia is an admirable woman. She deserves every good thing." "Yes," I agreed. "The error," he said, "is in the assumption that admiration is sufficient. That compatibility of station and purpose is the same thing as wanting." I held the silence for a moment. Then, "No," I said. "They are not the same thing." "No. What do you want, James?" He looked at me directly, and in the firelight his eyes had the expression of a man who has been carrying something in his arms for a long time, and is only now acknowledging how heavy it is. "I want," he said slowly, as if each word were being lifted from somewhere it had been held down for considerable time, "to be in a house that is not quiet. I want to speak to someone who says what they actually mean without dressing it for company, without calculating its reception. I want to be corrected when I am wrong, not carefully, not diplomatically, but simply told. The way a person speaks when they are not managing me." He stopped. Then, quieter, "I want there to be a person in this house who thinks about the person who wears the things rather than the things themselves." I closed my eyes for a moment. "James," I said. "Don't," he said. "I know what you are going to say." "I don't think you do," I said. "I was going to say that you should think very carefully about what it is that you are, in fact, telling me." A long silence. "I know what I am telling you," he said. "Then you also know," I said carefully, "that there are several people whose lives are considerably at stake here, and that the time for this conversation was some months ago and not 3 weeks before the wedding." "I know that." His voice was very quiet. "I know exactly that." We sat in silence for some time. The fire burned down. The clock on the mantel struck midnight, which seemed either very early or very late, depending on how you were inclined. "What are you going to do?" I asked. "I do not know," he said. "Nothing rash. I am going to think." "Good," I said. "Think." He thought. For the next 3 weeks he thought, and I watched him think, and it was one of the most exhausting things I have ever watched, because James Montfort was not a man given to half measures. When he thought with his whole being, turning a thing from every angle, examining each face of it, putting it down and picking it up again. The thinking showed. It showed in the set of his jaw over the breakfast accounts. It showed in the length of his silences at dinner. It showed in the way he rode out in the mornings for longer than his usual circuit, and came back still looking as if his mind had not moved. The 1st of January brought the new year in with a frost that sheathed the park in white and made the bare trees look like silverwork against a pale sky. It was a beautiful, silent morning, and I found James standing on the front steps when I came down, looking out at it as if he were memorizing it. "Happy New Year," I said. "Yes," he said, not perfunctory, genuine, but subdued. I stood beside him and looked at the frost. The silence between us was comfortable in the way the silence between old friends can be, even when the silence is full of things that are not comfortable. "Edmund," he said after a while. "Yes. She told you the house was lonely." "She did. And she told you it might change. She said the right arrangement of circumstances might change it. Those were her words. She was careful." "She is always careful," he said. "Yes," I said, "she is." Another silence. "That is not," he said, "a small thing from her. She does not say imprecise things." "No," I agreed, "she does not." He turned and went back inside. The week between New Year's and the wedding was the strangest week I ever spent at Ravemore Hall. The house was full of preparation. The Dowager had final opinions on the order of service. There was a rehearsal at St. Aldrich's on the 10th that I attended as groomsman. The carriage horses had been examined and exercised. All the correct machinery was in motion, and James moved through it with an impeccable, seamless correctness that was, to my eyes, one of the most remarkable performances I had ever seen him give. He was present at every occasion. He did everything correctly, and beneath all of it was a stillness that had moved past tension into something quieter and more final, the stillness of a man who has made a decision and is waiting for the moment to act on it. On the 10th of January, I did something I have never told anyone but James. I went to Milsom Lane. I do not know exactly what I intended. I had in my mind some vague notion of understanding the situation more completely before it reached its irrevocable conclusion. The workshop on Milsom Lane was a modest building, its sign painted in plain black letters, its windows showing the clean and orderly interior of a professional space. I knocked. She opened the door herself. She was wearing a work apron over a plain blue dress, and she had a pin tucked between her lips and another in her hand, and she looked at me with the assessing expression and said, around the pin, "Lord Ware." "Miss Callum," I said, "I am sorry to arrive without warning." She took the pin out of her mouth. "Come in," she said, "mind the pinboard on the left." Her assistant looked up from a workbench in the back room and then back down at her work with the discretion of someone well-trained. Verity led me to the front of the room and gestured to a plain chair near the window. She sat on a stool near the dress form and looked at me with the patient attentiveness of someone waiting for an unclear question to become clearer. "How may I help you?" she said. "I don't entirely know," I admitted. "I found myself here and I am not certain of the reason." She considered this. "Did you want to speak about the commission?" "None of it. The work is, by all accounts, extraordinary. That is not why I came." She waited. "I came," I said, "because I wanted to understand something about you, as a person." "It sounds like you have something on your mind that is not quite formed yet," she said. "Which is not alarming. It is familiar. I grew up with an older brother. He used to arrive in the middle of whatever I was working on with that exact expression. I learned to simply wait. I felt something ease in me that I hadn't known was tight. "The wedding is on the 14th, I said. "Yes, I know." "Are you?" I asked because I wanted to know whether there was anything you wished to say, to anyone, before. A long silence. "No," she said finally. Her voice was even and careful. "There is nothing I wish to say. This is not my affair to have wishes in. The Duke of Ravemore is about to be married, and it is nothing whatsoever to do with me." "Isn't it?" I said. She looked at me with those clear, taking everything in eyes, and for a moment I saw beneath the professional composure something that was not nothing, not dramatically, just the faintest weight of something she was carrying with considerable care and considerable restraint. "Lord Ware," she said very steadily, "I am a working woman with a workshop and a commission book and a life that I have built carefully from very modest materials. The Duke of Ravemore is a man of considerable title, estate, and social position who is 4 days from his wedding. Whatever you have come here to ask me, or to suggest, I would ask you to consider very carefully what good it serves." "What if the answer is considerable good?" I said. She was quiet for a long time. "That would be," she said at last, "the opinion of someone who is not the one who will bear the consequences." I looked at my hands. "Yes," I said, "that is fair." "I do not believe," she said quietly, "that anything useful can come from this conversation." "No," I agreed. I stood up. "I am sorry to have troubled you." "You have not troubled me," she said, and then, after a pause in which I thought she was not going to say anything more, "Please give my regards to the hall. It was a house I was glad to work in." I left. I walked back through the city toward Ravemore Hall in the January cold, and I thought about what she had said. This is not my affair to have wishes in, and what she had not said, which was that she had none. The 13th of January, the eve of the wedding, was the last night I spoke to James before the ceremony. He came to my room at 10:30, and he sat in the chair by the fire, and we did not speak for some time. Then he said, "She came to deliver the gown on the 21st of December. "Yes," I said. "I was not here. I had ridden to Aldenmere for the solicitors." He paused. "I arranged to be away." I was quiet. "Because," he said, "I knew that if I were here I would go to the gallery and the light would be on and I would stop in the doorway, and I did not know what I would say." "What would you have said?" I asked. He stared at the fire. "Something that I had not yet decided I had the right to say," he said. "Something that would have committed us both, without asking her properly whether she would wish to be committed." And now, he said, "the gown is at Morven House and the wedding is tomorrow," and he stopped. He put his head in his hands, then he looked up. "Edmund, I am going to make a terrible mistake." I looked at him. Then I said very carefully, "Which one?" He stared at me, then he understood. "Either way I make one," he said. "If I go through with it, I marry a woman I esteem but do not love. I tie us both to something that will work perfectly well and will cost us both things we have not yet calculated. If I do not, I have given my word. My word means something." "Your word means everything," I agreed. "Which is why the question of to whom you have given it, and whether you can keep it without breaking something larger, matters rather considerably." He was quiet. "James," I said, "I am not going to tell you what to do. I am not able to tell you what to do, but I will say this. I went to Milsom Lane yesterday." He stared at me. "Edmund." "I know," I said. "I went because I could not leave it alone. I went to see her, and I asked her whether there was anything she wished to say. And she said that this was not her affair to have wishes in," I said. "She said she was a working woman with a careful life. She said she hoped the work had given satisfaction." I looked at him steadily. "And then she said, choosing each word with the care she always uses, that it was a house she was glad to work in." He was absolutely still. "I am telling you," I said, "because I think you deserve to know it. I think there is a difference between what she said and what she meant, and you are better placed than I am to understand that difference." He stood up. He crossed to the window and stood there with his back to me, looking out at the January dark, and I could see in the line of his shoulders something that was not quite resolution, but was moving toward it from a very short distance. "Good night, Edmund," he said. "Good night," I said. He left. I sat by the fire for a long time. The morning of the 14th of January, 1822, was the coldest day of that winter. When I woke at 7 and opened my curtains, the park beyond the window was a flat, pale expanse of frost-hardened ground under a sky that had the specific colorless quality of a sky that is about to produce weather, not snow, but ice and wind, and the kind of cold that makes breathing feel like a small act of intent. The household was organized and running smoothly. The dowager was dressed and magnificent. The carriages were being brought round. The wedding was at 11 and it was just past 8. I went downstairs to find James. He was not at breakfast. He was not in the library. He was not in the morning room. His valet had laid out the wedding suit an hour earlier, as instructed, and confirmed that his grace had been present at 6:30 for his morning preparations and had then dismissed him. Beyond that, no one could account for him. I found him in the stables. He was standing in the aisle between the stalls with his riding coat already on, not the wedding coat, the heavy everyday one he wore in bad weather, and he was speaking quietly to Ashwick, the bay hunter, the horse he rode on ordinary days. His evening dress was on the stall door, folded neatly. He had dressed and then undressed, or perhaps he had never dressed for the wedding at all. There was a quality of settled calm about him that I had not seen in weeks. His face, when he turned at my footstep on the stable floor, was the face of a man who has made a decision that cost him something real, and who is at peace with the cost in the particular way of a person who has stopped lying to themselves. I stopped in the doorway. He looked at me. "Edmund," he said. "James," I said. "I need you to go ahead to the church," he said. "I need you to speak with Lady Cecilia before the service begins. She deserves to hear it properly. She deserves to hear it from someone who will say it with the kindness it warrants. I cannot be the one to speak to her directly because I cannot be in that cathedral and also be." "Also be what?" I said. "Also be riding to Milsom Lane," he said, with the clarity of a man who has spent all night arriving at a truth and has arrived at it too completely to speak it in any other way. I looked at him for a long moment. "James," I said, "think very carefully." "I have thought of nothing else for 3 months," he said. "Edmund, I have been thinking of nothing else since October. Since a woman in this stable told me to close a door because the draft would disturb the silk." He looked at Ashwick, then back at me. "I cannot marry Cecilia Ashfield because I cannot give her what she deserves. She deserves a husband who is actually present, who is not spending every evening finding reasons to walk past a particular room, who does not lie awake because a seamstress said his house was lonely, and he could not disagree, and he could not stop thinking about whether she might be the reason it might not be." I was silent. "She may refuse me," he said. "She may have been perfectly correct that this is not her affair, and she may send me away, and if she does I will have destroyed my engagement and my honor for nothing, and I will have to live with that. But I cannot stand at that altar and say those words to a woman I esteem and know, while I am saying them, that they are not the truest thing I have ever felt. She deserves better than words said as a performance. Everyone in this situation deserves better than that." I stood in the doorway of the stable on a freezing January morning and looked at my oldest friend. "What do you need me to say to Lady Cecilia?" I asked. His shoulders dropped very slightly. "The truth," he said, "that I have behaved dishonorably in a way I cannot entirely account for except to say that I did not understand, until it was too late, what it is that I actually feel. That she deserves every good thing, and I am profoundly sorry to be the person standing in the way of her finding it. That there is someone else, and I should have known it sooner, and the failing is entirely mine. She will not," I said carefully, "be surprised." He looked at me. "Women are considerably more observant than we give them credit for," I said. "Lady Cecilia has been a composed and gracious fiancée. She has also been a woman who was aware that something was held at a slight distance from her. She asked me in December whether you were a man who was in general content." I paused. I did not know how to answer it honestly, so I answered carefully, and she understood the careful answer. "And she understood," he said. "I believe so." I paused. "She will not be pleased and she will be hurt, and I will not minimize that. But I do not think she will be surprised." He was quiet for a moment. Then, "She deserves better than this." "Yes," I said, "she does, and she will get it from someone who is present." I paused. "Go, James, if you are going, go now before the cold sets in worse." He looked at me once more, a look that had 30 years in it, all the things we had been through together, all the times he had been the one who knew what was right and did it regardless of the cost. Then he turned, led Ashwick out of the stall, saddled him in 3 efficient minutes, and rode out of the stable yard at a canter east toward Aldenmere. I stood in the empty stable for a moment, listening to the hoofbeats recede. Then I called for a carriage and went to St. Aldrich's Cathedral to do the most difficult thing I have ever done in my life. Lady Cecilia received the news with the composure of a woman who has been trained since childhood in the art of not letting her face betray her. She was in the vestry with her maid, and she sat very still for a moment after I finished speaking. Then she said, "Is there someone else?" "Yes," I said. "Someone I know." "I do not believe so." She was quiet. Through the thick stone wall I could hear the distant murmur of the congregation assembled in the nave. "Does she care for him?" she asked. "I believe so," I said. "Yes." "Then it would have been very unkind," she said slowly, "to proceed. Not to me, I mean to all 3 of us. It would have been very unkind to all 3 of us in different ways." She stood up. She was in the bridal gown, the ivory silk that Verity Callum had made, falling in its perfect line. She looked at it for a moment. "You are aware," she said quietly, "that I knew." I was very still. Not specifically, she said. I did not know there was a particular person. I knew there was something James was not saying, something he was managing very well, which is what he does, but which was being managed, which means it existed. She looked at me. A woman who is paying attention can generally tell the difference between a man who is present and a man who is present correctly. Yes, I said. I believe that is true. I chose to proceed, she said carefully, because I had agreed to proceed and because I thought perhaps it was simply nerves or the difficulty of the adjustment. I thought it might settle. She paused. I was perhaps wishing rather than observing. You are being very kind, I said. I am being honest, she said, which is something I have not done enough of in this particular situation. She looked at me steadily. Tell him I hope she is worthy of it. I will, I said. She didn't say anything else. I left the vestry, and I went to speak to Lady Morven, which I will not describe in detail, because even 30 years later, the memory of Lady Morven's face in that moment is one I keep in a very closed drawer. The ride from Ravemore Hall to Milsom Lane on a clear morning takes perhaps 20 minutes on a fast horse. On the morning of the 14th of January 1822, with the temperature dropping and a wind coming off the northern hills, with a freezing mist that had come down over the city and turned the cobblestones treacherous, it took James Montfort 35 minutes. He told me about the ride, over the years, in different ways at different stages of his life. When we were still young and raw from the consequences, he told it briefly. When we were older and the peace had come, when the thing that had come of it had settled into 30 years of evidence, he told it with a wondering gratitude that I found moving every time. What he said consistently was that the cold did not bother him. He was aware of it intellectually, aware that he was very cold, that the mist was turning to ice crystals on his coat and the horse's mane, that the world was a silver-white absence of visibility. But his mind was on the question of what he would say when he arrived. He had worked out the decision. He had not worked out the words. By the time Ashwick's hooves found the cobblestones of Milsom Lane and slowed to a careful walk on the treacherous surface, he still had not worked out the words. Verity Callum was in the back of the workshop, doing the meticulous finishing work on a commission that was due at the end of the week. She heard the hoofbeats approach and stop, the only sounds in a very quiet street, at that hour in that cold, with the city largely occupied with the spectacle of a ducal wedding. And she went to the window and saw a man in a heavy riding coat pulling a bay horse to a stop in front of the workshop. She told me all of this. In later years, when we were all old enough that the story belonged to all of us rather than only to them, she told it with the dry humor of a woman who has had decades to find the comedy in the situation. I saw him from the window, she told me once at a dinner many years later, and my first thought was perfectly rational. I thought, he has come about a commission. The slight, real smile appeared. My second thought came when I recognized the horse. My third thought took somewhat longer. Her third thought was, it is the morning of his wedding. She went to the door. He was standing outside it without a hat, his riding coat soaked from the ice and the mist, and he looked, she said, like a man who had ridden through a storm, which was accurate. He was breathing hard from the cold. His hair was disordered in the way of someone who has ridden fast into a headwind. His expression was not wild. James was never wild in his expression, but it was stripped of the usual careful control, the governed manner he wore the way other men wore their coats. He looked, she said, like himself, like the person that was underneath the Duke, that she had seen glimpses of in the long gallery and the sewing-room doorway, and the December midnight that she had replayed in her mind more times than she chose to count. She opened the door fully. He said, Miss Callum. She said, Your Grace. A pause that lasted perhaps 4 seconds and felt considerably longer. What are you doing here? She said. Her voice was even. She was, she told me later, working very hard to keep it even. He stopped. He had planned words and they had deserted him the moment he saw her face. I could not do it, he said. She was quiet for a moment. Do what? She said, though she already knew. There was only one thing it could be. Marry her, he said. Stand at the altar and say those words while he stopped. He looked at her with the directness he had given her in the gallery, the same total attention, the same absence of performance. While you exist, he said, not what he had planned to say, the truth instead. While you exist and I know it and I feel what I feel and have felt it since October, I could not say those words and have them be a lie, and the only reason they would be a lie is because of you, and I thought, he stopped. I thought you should know that. Whatever you say or don't say, I thought you deserved to know that it was true. She stared at him. I know what this is, he said. I know what I have done this morning and what it will cost, and I know what I am asking you to. I am not asking you for anything specific. I rode here because I needed to be honest. That is what I came to do. Come inside, she said. He came inside. She closed the door. The warmth of the workshop hit him after the outside cold, and she watched him absorb it with the slightly dazed quality of a man who has been operating on pure resolve for long enough that simple warmth feels surprising. Sit down, she said. He sat in the plain chair by the window. He looked at the dress form, the rolls of fabric, the ordered space she had built and maintained on Milsom Lane for the better part of 6 years. Then he looked at her where she was standing with her back to the stove, her hands very still at her sides. Miss Callum, he said. Give me a moment, she said. He gave her a moment. The stove ticked. The mist pressed against the windows. Outside, the city was quiet in the particular way of a city where a large event has drawn everyone to one location, leaving the streets empty and the lanes silent. The whole of Aldenmere at St. Aldrich's, waiting for a wedding that was not going to happen. She turned. She had the kettle and 2 cups, and she set them on the work table with the precision she brought to everything, and she looked at him. You have left her at the altar, she said. Yes. In front of 120 people. About that number. Yes. The entire ton will know by this afternoon. Yes. She set down the cup she was holding. Your Grace, what do you believe happens now? He looked at her steadily. That depends, he said, on what you say. A long silence. The stove ticked. Outside, a cart passed slowly on the frozen cobblestones, the horse's hooves tentative on the ice. What am I supposed to say? She said, and her voice had something in it now that was not quite composure. The composure of a person working very hard against something pressing from the inside. You have come here on the morning of your wedding, which you have apparently not attended, and you are sitting in my workshop, and you are telling me. I am telling you, he said, what is true. And what am I meant to do with what is true? Whatever you choose, he said. I am not here to put you under any obligation. I am here because I could not go to that altar and say those words, and the reason I could not is you, and you deserve to know that. That is all I can say about the ought of it. What you say or don't say is entirely your own. She looked at him for a long time. He held the look with the same patient steadiness he had given her in the gallery at midnight. He was not asking her to rescue him or to resolve the situation. He was not performing remorse or certainty. He was simply there, soaked and cold and entirely honest, which was, she told me once years later, the most disarming thing he could possibly have done. You cannot ask me what I feel, she said. Not, she stopped. She pressed both hands flat on the table. I told Lord Ware this is not my affair to have wishes in. Lord Ware told me what you said, he said. He told me you also said it was a house you were glad to work in. She was very still. I know what you meant by it, he said quietly. Or I think I do, and I could be wrong. I am asking you to tell me whether I am wrong. Another long silence, the longest so far. You are not wrong, she said very quietly. He closed his eyes briefly, just for a moment. Then he opened them again. Verity, he said. It was the first time he had used her given name. She told me later that it was the most significant moment of the whole conversation, because she had been managing the distance, holding the work table as a kind of boundary between what was happening and what she was going to allow herself to feel about what was happening. And then he said her name, and the table became irrelevant. James, she said, not your Grace, his given name, returned. I have made a considerable mess, he said. Yes, she agreed, you have. I intend to make it right, he said. In every way I can and as thoroughly as possible. Lady Cecilia deserves. I will not hide or minimize what I have done to her. I will accept the consequences. He paused. What I am asking you, what I want to know is whether, when the mess is made right and the consequences are accepted, you would be willing to consider, whether you would consider being married to me. She stared at him. I have no right to ask it, he said. I know I have no right. I have just done a thing that has cost a perfectly admirable woman a great deal of pain and embarrassment, and I am sitting in your workshop in a wet riding coat asking you for something I have not yet earned. I know that. I am asking anyway because I cannot think of another honest thing to do. He paused. I can come back. I can leave now and come back in a month or 3 months or whatever is required. I am not asking for an immediate answer. I am asking whether the question is answerable at all. She looked at him across the work table in the workshop on Milsom Lane, in the frozen city of Aldenmere, with the mist pressing against the windows and the stove ticking and the dress form in the background with its unfinished work, and she said, "Your coat is soaked through." He looked at it. "Yes. You will take a chill if you do not dry it." "I imagine I will." "Stay until it dries, then." She turned to the kettle. "And then go back to the hall and deal with all of it. There is a very great deal of it to deal with." He was quiet for a moment, and the question. She poured the water into the cups carefully. Then she said without turning, "The question is answerable. I do not yet know what the answer is. I need time." "Take all of it you need," he said. She turned and put a cup in front of him. "I did not notice," she said, "when I first saw you this morning that you had left your hat somewhere." "I left it in the stable," he said. "I was in rather a hurry." "I see," she said. She sat on her stool. "Drink the tea, it will help with the cold." He picked up the cup. He looked at her across the small table, in the modest workshop on the frozen morning, and something in his face. The Duke of Ravemore, who had spent 30 years organized around obligation and propriety. Something in his face was simply, cleanly glad. "Thank you," he said. "It is tea," she said. "It is not a particularly remarkable act." "I was not thanking you for the tea," he said. She looked at him for a moment. "Then I know," she said. They sat on either side of the work table and drank their tea, and the ice pressed against the windows, and the stove ticked, and outside the city of Aldenmere began, in its various corners, to understand that something unprecedented had happened at St. Aldrich's Cathedral that morning. I will not recount in full everything that followed. The conversation with Lady Morven, the weeks of social consequence that fell across Aldenmere and then across London when the news arrived, as it did within the week. The letters James received, and the calls paid and not received, and the variety of responses from the variety of people whose opinion he had previously considered important and now considered in a different light. I will say that Lady Cecilia bore it with a dignity that increased my regard for her considerably. She withdrew from society for 2 months, which was appropriate and what anyone would have done, and when she reappeared she did so with the composed, collected manner she had always had, and with the look of someone who has processed something and arrived on the other side. She was married the following autumn to a man of excellent temperament who regarded her with the specific, warm, paying-attention quality that James had never quite managed, and who was very much what she had always deserved. I attended the wedding. She thanked me for coming. I said she looked extremely well. She said that she was, rather to her own surprise, extremely well. That was the most either of us said about any of it. The months between January and September of 1822 were, from the outside, a period of resolution. James addressed what he had done with the thoroughness he had promised himself. He moved through the conversations that needed having, the apologies that were owed, the consequences that were his to bear, with the same organized, careful practicality that characterized everything he did. He also came to Milsom Lane. He came beginning in February, not every day, not with any pressure, but with the regular presence of a man who has stated an intention and is keeping it. He came in the morning when she was working, and he sat in the plain chair near the window, and they talked. About the workshop and the commission book and the problems of running a small business in a cathedral city. About the estate and the concerns of a difficult winter. About his father, and she about her mother who had died when she was 16, and who she could still hear sometimes giving an opinion in the back of her mind. They talked about books, about which they disagreed with a frequency and a specificity that suggested they had both thought hard about books, and did not consider agreement the only acceptable outcome of that thought. They argued she was not a woman who agreed for the sake of agreement. He was not a man who adjusted his views easily. Their disagreements were good ones, the kind where both people are actually listening, actually thinking, actually changed by what the other one says, even if they do not immediately acknowledge it. He told me once that arguing with Verity Callum was the most intellectually honest thing he had done in years, and it showed in the arguments. They were precise and well-reasoned and left both of them slightly differently positioned than when they started. He asked her to walk with him once the frost cleared in March. They walked in the parks and along the river and through the market, where Verity knew the prices of everything and had opinions about 3 of the 4 butchers and a particular loyalty to the baker on the corner of the market square whose bread, she informed James with the confidence of extensive experience, was worth the extra walk. James had grown up managing an estate from above. He had thought he understood how the world ran. Verity Callum showed him a number of things he had been slightly wrong about, without instruction and without condescension, simply by being in them with him. In April, he asked whether she was still considering. "Yes," she said. And he said, "And I will tell you when I know," she said. "I am still determining what I actually think, as opposed to what I am afraid of thinking." "What are you afraid of thinking?" She looked at him. They were walking along the river path, which was green with early spring, and the sun was warm enough to be felt without quite being warm. "I am afraid," she said slowly, "of thinking that it is possible, and of being wrong, and of the cost of being wrong. I am afraid of miscalculating the fit." She paused. "That is what I always check for when I am uncertain about a piece of work, whether the fear is of the work itself or of my miscalculating the difficulty. If it is the work itself, I address the work. If it is the miscalculation I am afraid of, that is a different question." "And which is this?" he asked. She was quiet for a moment. "I think it is the second. I am not afraid of you or of this. I am afraid of being wrong about how well it fits." "How would you check for the fit?" he asked, with the genuine curiosity he brought to things that interested him. She looked at him, then the slight real smile. "I am doing it," she said. He nodded. "Then keep doing it," he said, "for as long as you need." "You are remarkably patient," she said, "for a man of your position." "I am remarkably motivated," he said, "which is not the same thing." She laughed, a real laugh, brief and unguarded, that he had apparently been trying to produce for some weeks and that, he told me, was the most satisfying thing he had heard since October. In June, she came to Ravemore Hall on the 2nd of the month, the first time she had come back since December, and she was shown to the drawing room rather than the sewing room. And when James came in, she was standing at the window looking at the park in its June fullness, the oaks in full leaf, the grass long and green. James came in and stopped. She turned from the window. "Yes," she said. He was very still. "Yes," she said again. "The answer is yes. It fits well enough that I am not afraid of it anymore." He said nothing for a moment. Then he crossed the room and he took her hand carefully, the way he did careful things, and he said, "Thank you." "I have conditions," she said. "I expected you would," he said. She had 3. The workshop would continue operating. She would attend it as her time permitted, and she intended her time to permit it considerably, because she was not a woman who intended to sit in drawing rooms indefinitely. She would not be required to perform a version of herself that was not herself in social situations. She understood that there were social situations, and she would attend them and be appropriate and civil. But she would not pretend to be something she was not for the comfort of people who did not know her. And there was a bread baker on the corner of the market square whose bread was worth the extra walk, and she intended to continue to think so regardless of her new address. "Agreed," he said, to all 3, including the bread baker. "Without hesitation," she noted. "Without hesitation," he confirmed. She looked at him with the assessing look that I had first received on the servant's doorstep. "You are sure?" "I have been sure since the 14th of December," he said. "The long gallery, you told me the house was lonely." "I said the house had the potential to be otherwise." "I know what you said," he said. "I have had every word of it for 6 months." She was quiet for a moment. Then, "I have been afraid that you might have idealized it, what happened between us, that it might have grown in the absence of ordinary day-to-day reality into something larger than it actually is." "Has it?" he asked. She thought about it honestly, as she did everything. "No," she said finally. "No, I do not think so. I have spent 5 months making quite certain it has not, by being very practical about what I observe when we are in company together. And I find, consistently, that I would rather be arguing with you about the economics of the estate than not arguing with you about anything." "That is," he said, with the quiet softness that was his version of warmth, "one of the kindest things anyone has ever said to me." She looked at him, then the real smile. "You should probably set a higher standard," she said. They were married in September, at St. Aldrich's Cathedral, with the dean officiating and a congregation considerably smaller than the one assembled in January. by design on both sides. It was a morning service, clean and not lengthy, and Verity wore a gown she had made herself. It was ivory, not dissimilar in shade to the bridal gown she had made for Lady Cecilia, but different in every other respect. It was cut for her particular build, the morning light of a September service, the need to move through a long day of standing and greeting and sitting and standing again. It was the finest thing she had ever made that she would herself wear, and she had put into it everything she knew about the difference between what a person looks like at a single moment and what a garment does for the person across the whole of a long and consequential event. James, when she walked into the church, had an expression I have never quite seen on any other face. I have been married myself for 40 years, and I know what it is to have a person walk toward you and feel the whole world organize itself around that fact. But there was something in his face, as she walked toward him in the September morning light, that was beyond the happiness of the moment. Something that was the relief of a very long doubt resolved, and the recognition of something he had suspected since October and known since December, and waited through 6 months of consequences to get to say out loud. She reached him. The dean said the words. James said, "I will," in the calm, deliberate tone of a man who means what he says precisely and is very glad to be saying it. Verity said, "I will," in the even, clear voice of a person who has checked the fit from every angle and found it sound. And the house on the hill above Aldenmere stopped being as quiet as it had been. In the 30 years since that September morning, I have had a great deal of time to think about what I witnessed and what I believe it means. There is a version of this story that circulated in the Ton for several years. In that version, James Montfort behaved dishonorably toward Lady Cecilia Ashfield, caused a significant social scandal, and married beneath his station, a seamstress, of all things, for reasons that were never entirely explained to anyone's satisfaction. This version is not without truth. He did act dishonorably toward Lady Cecilia. The scandal was real. The marriage was considered beneath his station by everyone who measured by those standards. All of that is accurate. What this version misses is the part that interests me most, which is what actually happened, as opposed to what it looked like from the outside by people who were not in the long gallery, or the sewing room, or the workshop on Milsom Lane on a freezing January morning. Verity Callum did not arrive at Ravemore Hall to make James Montfort love her. She arrived with a leather satchel and a measuring tape to complete a commission, and she did the commission with the exactness and the principle that characterized everything she did. She told him to close a door because of the draft, and told me the house was lonely without apology or softening, and made a gown cut for a woman who would be moving through the world rather than standing still for inspection. She did nothing to draw his attention beyond existing in the particular way she existed, clearly, honestly, without performance. She drew it anyway, because the thing she was not a thing he had previously encountered in his particular orbit, and it turned out to be the thing he needed more than he had known there was a word for. He spent 3 months trying to be sensible about it. He had an excellent record of sensibleness. He had organized his entire existence on its basis. The sensible thing was the engagement to Lady Cecilia, and the sensible thing was to go through with it, and he tried with the whole force of his considerable will. He failed. Not because he was weak, he was, in most respects, the least weak man I have known, but because what he felt was too accurate to be overridden by what was sensible. I think about this sometimes. I think about the cost of accuracy. He paid a cost on the 14th of January that was real, a woman's embarrassment and pain, a scandal that lasted years, the good opinion of a number of people that he did not recover. These were not nothing. They were, in fact, considerable. The question of whether it was worth them is one I am not able to answer for anyone but myself, and from where I stand, 30 years down the road, watching what the Ravemore household became, I think yes. But I want to be careful with that yes, because I know that the cost was not paid only by James. What I can say without any reservation is this: I watched the house on the hill above Aldenmere change. Not dramatically, not in any single event, but over the months and the seasons and the slow accumulation of days, it changed. Rooms that had been closed and tidy opened and became lived in. There were conversations at dinner that turned corners and went somewhere nobody had predicted at the start. There was a study where 2 people argued about nearly everything with a frequency and a quality of engagement that could be heard from the corridor, and which left the estate accounts, and the management decisions consistently better than they had been before the arguing. There was a practice, developed in the first year and maintained thereafter, of James reading aloud in the evenings, which he had not done since his father's time and which Verity had requested because she liked it, and the sound of his voice reading filled the rooms where the silence had been. They had 3 children, 2 sons and a daughter, who were, by the time they were old enough to form opinions, the most thoughtful and least easily managed children in Aldenmere, and who had from their mother the quality of taking everything in and giving back only what they chose, and from their father the quality of thinking carefully and then being extremely determined. The combination was, depending on the occasion, impressive or exhausting, and often both simultaneously. I was at the hall for a Christmas many years later, when the children were older and had children of their own beginning to be old enough to cause trouble, and the house was full in the way that houses are full when the generation that grew up in them has come back and brought the next generation with them. I was sitting in the library after dinner with James and Verity and 2 grandchildren who had not yet been put to bed, and who were engaged in a complicated game involving carved wooden pieces on the floor. And the fire was good, and the brandy was the excellent Ravemore brandy that had not changed since James's father's time, and the room had the quality of a room where people were content to remain exactly where they were. Verity looked up at some point from the book she was reading and found me looking at the room. "What are you thinking?" she said. "I am thinking," I said, "that you were right. In October, the first time we spoke, you told me it was a house with good bones." She smiled, the real one. "It is," she said. "You were right about the other thing too," I said. "That it might change, given the right arrangement of circumstances." She looked at James, who was watching the grandchildren play with the expression of a man who is exactly where he intended to be, which is to say exactly where he could not have told you in October 1821 that he needed to go. Then she looked back at me. "Yes," she said, "I think it has." James looked up. He looked at me, and then at Verity, and then at the fire, and then back at the game on the floor, and then he said, without looking up, "Edmund." "James," I said, "you are being maudlin." "I am being accurate," I said. "There is a distinction." He made the short sound that was almost a laugh, that I had known for 50 years, that I had heard for the first time in the corridors of Aldenmere Grammar on a gray October morning, and had been glad to hear ever since. One of the grandchildren looked up from the floor. "Grandpapa says that because he does not want you to look at him while he is being pleased about things," this child said, with the directness of someone who had inherited it from 2 directions. "He does not like being observed being pleased." "I am well aware," I said. "He was pleased about something at dinner too," the child continued, "when Grandmama said the thing about the garden." "Yes," I said, "he usually is." James was very deliberately not looking at anyone. Verity set her book down. "To bed," she said to the grandchildren with a tone that was not a suggestion. "Both of you." The grandchildren went. The room quieted. The fire settled. Verity picked up her book again, and James returned his attention to whatever he had been thinking about, and I held my glass of brandy and looked at the room around me and thought the things I have been trying to put into words here for 30 years. There are stories a man carries for the rest of his life not because they are extraordinary in the telling, but because they changed the shape of everything that came after. What changed, in this story, was a house. What changed was the quality of the silence in a particular set of rooms. What changed was the expression on the face of a man I had known for 50 years, in every variety of circumstance, and had never seen in quite this way. The expression of a person who has arrived somewhere after a long and difficult journey and recognized it as the place they were trying to get to all along, even before they knew they were traveling. This is what she did, Verity Callum, now Verity Montfort, Duchess of Ravemore, for 30 years, not by intention and not by strategy, but simply by being exactly what she was, without performance and without apology. She gave a man who had organized his entire life around doing everything correctly the experience of doing one thing truly. Of choosing, for once, not the thing that was required, but the thing that was real. Of riding through ice on a January morning, because the only honest direction was toward a workshop on Milsom Lane, and the woman inside it who had told him, without knowing she was saying it, that his house was lonely. He told her once, years later, that the ride through the ice was the best thing he had ever done, She told him this was a very high bar to set for a 25-minute ride on a familiar horse in manageable weather. He pointed out that the weather had not, in fact, been particularly manageable. She told him he was given to exaggeration. He told her he was given to precision. They argued about it for some time. From the corridor outside the study, where I happened to be passing, the arguing sounded like the most satisfying sound in Ravemore Hall. Which is to say, the sound of a house that is no longer quiet. I have told this as well as I know how. The rest, as I said, belongs to them. I want to go back now and fill in what I have compressed, because compression is the enemy of truth in a story like this one, and there are weeks and conversations and small moments that I have summarized in a line or two that deserve more than a line or two. The accumulation of it, the slow, relentless, unremarkable on the surface accumulation, was the whole substance of what happened. A man does not ride through ice on a January morning for a single conversation. He rides through ice for 11 weeks of small things that he told himself did not add up to what they added up to. Let me go back to November. The second week of November brought 3 days of rain that made the park invisible from the library windows and turned the formal drive into something resembling a tributary of the river Aldine. I was still at the hall. James was in the library with the November accounts, which were requiring more attention than usual due to a dispute with a tenant farmer over the terms of a lease that had been imprecisely drawn up in his father's time. I was reading, badly, the kind of reading where the eye moves across the page and the mind produces nothing, and the rain was making the kind of noise against the windows that makes every room feel smaller than it is. At some point in the middle of the afternoon, James set down his pen with a deliberateness that suggested he had come to the end of a particular rope in the lease dispute and needed to think about something else. She was here again this morning, he said. I looked up from my book, Miss Callum. She had come in from the rain. She was in the entrance hall when I came through, and she was wringing the water from the cuff of her coat over the flagstones in the manner of someone who had judged that the flagstones could absorb this and was correct. He paused. She did not see me immediately. She was looking at the staircase. He paused again. The staircase is a fine one, I said. She noticed the repair on the third banister post, he said. The join where my grandfather had a new piece set in after the original cracked. It is not noticeable unless you are looking carefully. He picked up his pen again and set it down. She said, when she saw me, she said, that is good joinery. The repair, someone took care with it. I was quiet. She then went upstairs to the sewing room, he said, and I came in here to do the accounts. And instead you are telling me about her, I said. He looked at me, then he looked at the accounts. I am telling you about good joinery, he said. Yes, I said, quite. He went back to the accounts. I went back to my book, which I still did not read, because I was thinking about the repair on the third banister post, and the fact that James, who had lived in this house for 6 years, had not mentioned the repair on the third banister post in any context I could recall, and that a woman who had been in the building for 3 weeks had noticed it and said something true about it, and that this had apparently lodged in him with the force of something considerably more significant than good joinery. The third week of November had a Tuesday on which I happened to be passing through the ground floor corridor at around 11:30 in the morning. I was going to the garden room to retrieve a pair of gloves I had left there, and I heard voices from behind the closed morning room door. Not raised voices, quiet ones, the kind of quiet that is not the same as cautious. I slowed my pace, not quite to a stop, because I was not prepared to commit to the full deception of standing in the corridor and listening, but I was willing to walk very slowly. James's voice, you knew before we did. Verity's voice, I beg your pardon. The panel in the long gallery, the one that has been separating from the plaster at the top. You mentioned it to Mrs. Darrow on the first day of this month. She mentioned it to me last Thursday. I had been meaning to look at it for 2 years. A pause. I mentioned it because I needed the light in the gallery to work accurately, and the panel's movement was causing a draft from behind the wall that made some of the finer fabrics move. Her voice was matter-of-fact. I was not offering an opinion on the state of the building. Nevertheless, he said, 2 years, and a woman who has been here 3 weeks noticed it in the first week. I notice things that affect my work, she said. The draft affected my work. Most people do not have reason to notice a draft from behind a wall plaster. And yet, he said, the panel will be addressed this week because you noticed it. A pause. Then her voice with something very slightly different in it, a question of tone that I could not quite identify from the corridor. Does that bother you? No, he said, and he sounded slightly surprised at his own answer. It does not bother me at all. It is only, I was thinking that it is a useful quality to notice things before they require notice. All of my work is about noticing things before they require notice, she said. A seam that will give under stress, a hem that will drag after 3 wearings, a lining that has been cut too tight for movement. You address these before the event rather than after. And if you do not notice in time, then you alter, she said. But altering after the fact is always more work than addressing before. And sometimes it is not possible, or it shows. I had reached the garden room by this point. I retrieved my gloves and walked back past the morning room at a perfectly normal pace, and I thought, she was talking about sewing. She was only talking about sewing. But I did not think he was only hearing about sewing. The 4th week of November, a Thursday, I was at the long table in the dining room helping myself to a late luncheon because I had missed the household's meal time due to a long walk in the park that had gone further than intended. Verity was in the servants' dining room across the corridor, which I knew because the door was open, and I could hear Mrs. Darrow speaking to her in the comfortable tones people use with someone they have decided to trust. I was not trying to overhear. I simply have good hearing, and the corridor was quiet. Mrs. Darrow was saying, "His Grace has asked whether you have everything you need for the next month's work." A brief pause. "Yes," Verity said. "Please tell him everything is well in hand." "He asks," Mrs. Darrow said, and here I could hear in her voice the slight precision of a woman choosing her words, "whether the sewing room is adequately heated. He noticed it was cold on Monday." "It is perfectly adequate, thank you," Verity said. "The fabrics require a consistent temperature and the room provides it." "He has asked me to add another coal allowance if you think it needed," Mrs. Darrow said. A pause longer than the previous ones. "Please thank His Grace," Verity said, "but the room is quite sufficient." "Very well," Mrs. Darrow said, in a tone that had a note in it that I recognized, the tone of a woman who has observed something, has formed a view about what she has observed, and has decided the view is not hers to share. I applied myself to my luncheon. A Saturday in the 1st week of December. I came around the corner of the stable block from the kitchen garden and nearly walked into James, who was standing in the yard with his arms crossed looking at the east wall of the stable block with the expression of a man conducting an inspection. He glanced at me and then back at the wall. "I am looking at the pointing," he said before I could say anything. "The pointing," I said. "Between the stones. It is deteriorating in the upper courses. It has been like this for some time. I have meant to have it addressed." He paused. "She asked about it." I said nothing. "She came through the yard on Wednesday," he said. "She was speaking to her assistant about the cart arrangement for delivering the first traveling costume to Morven House, and she glanced up at the wall and said to the girl, 'That pointing will want repointing before spring or the damp will get into the wall behind it.' Not to me. I was some distance away. She did not know I heard." "But you heard," I said. "I heard," he said. He continued looking at the wall. "I am having it addressed." "James," I said, "how often are you finding reasons to be in places where she is?" He was quiet for a moment. "I am moving about my own estate," he said carefully. "Yes," I said, "you are." He looked at me. I looked back. The silence between us contained a considerable number of unspoken observations on my side, and what I suspected was a near-equivalent number of unspoken acknowledgments on his. "The pointing," he said finally, and turned and went back into the house. I looked at the east wall of the stable block for a moment. The pointing was, as far as I could tell, entirely adequate. I was not an expert, but I was willing to form a view. The 2nd week of December brought 3 things of note. The first was a fitting for one of the traveling costumes, which Lady Cecilia attended with her maid, and during which James was present in the hall but visible at no point during the 2 hours it occupied. He had, I gathered from Mrs. Darrow, arranged to be in the home farm with his land steward from 9 o'clock until noon, which was almost exactly the duration of the fitting. He had arranged this appointment the day before when the fitting was scheduled. I stored this observation. The second was a conversation at dinner on the Wednesday between myself and the Dowager about the general progress of the household. The dowager was pleased with the wedding preparations. She was particularly pleased with the quality of the trousseau commission. "The work I have seen is exceptional," she said. "The woman knows her craft. I understand she has been entirely professional and very discreet." "Yes," I said, "she has." "Mrs. Darrow speaks highly of her," the dowager said. "And James," she paused, then, "James has spoken of her." I looked at the dowager with what I hoped was a neutral expression. "Has he?" "He mentioned the gown," the dowager said carefully. "He said it was a remarkable piece of work. He described the cut in some detail which surprised me because James has never described the cut of anything in detail in his life." She looked at me. "He has been to look at it." "He has," I said. "More than once, I believe," the dowager said. Mrs. Darrow mentioned, without quite mentioning, that His Grace had passed through the gallery several times during the evening hours while Miss Callum was working. She paused. She was noting it as a point of interest in the household, not as a concern. "And you," I said, "is it a concern for you?" The dowager looked at me with the steady, undeceivable gaze of a woman who has been watching people carefully for 60-odd years and has developed very accurate pattern recognition. "I do not know yet," she said precisely. "I am watching." The third thing of note in the second week of December was an evening I have not yet described, which happened on a Wednesday, which was the evening after the dowager made the above observation. I was not present for it. I heard about it later from James, in parts and at intervals, in the way he told things that he was still processing. He had gone to the gallery at 9:30. The light was on. He stood in the doorway rather than in the gallery proper, as had become the habit. She was working on what turned out to be a particularly difficult section of the bridal gown, the join between the bodice and the overskirt, which required a precision he had heard her describe to the housekeeper as unforgiving of anything short of exact. She was working with a focus that excluded him. She had not heard him approach. He stood there for perhaps 3 minutes, watching her work. He told me later, with the slight embarrassment of a man describing something he knows was unusual behavior, that he was watching the way her hands moved. Not romantically, or not only romantically, with a kind of attention to quality that he recognized from the way he watched his land steward assess soil or his head groom assess a horse's movement. He was watching someone be excellent at something, and he found it absorbing in the way that excellence at anything is absorbing to a person who cares about competence. Then she made a small sound, not a word, just a sound of frustration, and set down what she was working on and pressed her palms flat on the table and looked at the ceiling for a moment. He said, "What is wrong?" She startled. Not dramatically. She was not a person who startled dramatically. But she looked up with the quickly assembled composure of someone who has just had a private moment interrupted. "Your Grace," she said, then, "nothing is wrong. I have made an error that I will need to undo." "What kind of error?" She looked at him for a moment, assessing whether he was asking to be polite or because he actually wanted to know. She must have decided the latter because she said, "The panel at the center front of the bodice is 2 threads off alignment with the central seam. It is not visible to the eye, but I can feel it when I run my hand over the join, and I can see it now that I know where to look." "And the consequence of leaving it?" he asked. "The consequence of leaving it," she said, "is a bodice that fits now and pulls 6 months from now, once the fabric has had time to respond to the tension of the misalignment." She picked up the panel. "I will take it out and reset it." "That is hours of work," he said. "Yes," she agreed. "For something invisible to the eye." "For something invisible to the eye now," she said, "not invisible in 6 months." He was quiet for a moment. Then, "How do you decide what is good enough?" She looked at him. "I do not," she said. "I do not decide what is good enough. I do it correctly, and that is what it is." Another silence. Then he said, very quietly, "I would like that standard applied more broadly." She looked at him with the look that took everything in. "Would you?" she said. "I think," he said, "that it would be a very different way to live." She held the panel. She did not look away from him. "Most people," she said, "find it is very hard to apply, because it requires admitting when something is not correct and then doing the work of undoing it and doing it again. Most people prefer to say it is good enough and let the tension accumulate." "Yes," he said. He looked at the panel in her hands. "Yes, I think they do." A silence. Then she set the panel on the table and picked up her seam ripper with the resigned efficiency of someone who has accepted the work ahead, and he said good night, and she said good night, and that was where the conversation ended. But it was not where it ended for him. He told me later, much later, in the retrospective way you tell things when you understand them better than you did when they happened, that what she had said about the tension accumulating was the most precisely accurate description of his entire life that anyone had ever offered him. Not as observation, not as counsel, not as anything aimed at him at all. As a description of sewing. The tension accumulates, and eventually something gives, and the alteration after the fact is always more work than addressing the problem when you first see it. He had known, on some level since October, that something needed to be addressed. The third week of December was the last week Verity Callum worked at Ravemore Hall before delivering the gown. By this point the trousseau was nearly complete. The bridal gown, the 2 traveling costumes, the evening gown, and 3 of the 4-day dresses were finished. The 4th-day dress was being completed by her assistant at the workshop on Milsom Lane, with Verity overseeing. She was at the hall for 2 days that week, doing final adjustments and pressing and packing the pieces for transport to Morven House. She moved through the work with the particular focused efficiency of someone who is at the end of a large project and can see the finish line clearly, and she was quieter than usual. And twice, I saw her pause at a window overlooking the park and stand there for a moment longer than the work required. And both times she turned back to the work without changing her expression, as if she had made a decision. On the last day, the 20th of December, the day before she delivered the gown, James passed through the long gallery in the afternoon. She was there, folding the final pieces into tissue and then into the traveling boxes. He stopped in the gallery doorway. She looked up. "Are you pleased with how it has turned out?" he asked. She looked at the boxes, the tissue, the completed work. "Yes," she said. "I think it is the best work I have done on a commission of this size." "I think so too," he said. She looked at him. "I am not an expert," he said, "but I have watched it happen over 11 weeks, and I think it is the best work I have seen." She was quiet for a moment, then, "Thank you." "Thank you," he said, "for the care you have taken with it." She looked at the boxes again. "It was a remarkable commission," she said. "The materials were excellent, the brief was clear, and She stopped. She appeared to change direction. "It was a house I was glad to work in," she said. "I shall say so in any recommendation." "I hope," he said, "that you will find occasion to say so beyond a recommendation." She looked at him, the look that took everything in, a long moment. "Good evening, Your Grace," she said. "Good evening, Miss Callum," he said. He left the gallery. She did not move for a moment. Then she folded the last piece of tissue over the gown, smoothed it flat with her palm, and closed the box. "I want also to tell you about the month of February, 1822, when James first came to Milsom Lane, because I think the beginning of that is important, and I have passed over it too quickly. He came on the 4th. He had been to Milsom Lane twice before, once in the first week of February to leave a note, which was principally a polite inquiry as to whether he might call, and once on the 9th to receive Verity's reply, which was delivered via her assistant to Ravemore Hall and which said, in Verity's precise and unenthusiastic penmanship, that she saw no reason why he should not call, provided he understood that she was a working woman and he was not to disrupt the work. He came at 10 in the morning, which she had told him via the same note was acceptable, because it was after the heaviest of the morning commissions were underway and before the afternoon, when she needed her full concentration. He knocked. She opened the door. She had her work apron on, which was the first thing he mentioned. He noticed the apron, I think, the way you notice something that grounds a person in what they actually are rather than what a situation might be arranging them into. She was not performing a reception. She was a working woman who had paused work to answer the door. "Your Grace," she said. "Good morning," he said. "Thank you for agreeing to see me." "Come in," she said. "Mind the pinboard." He minded the pinboard. He sat in the plain chair, the same chair I had sat in, and she sat on her stool, and they looked at each other for a moment in the particular way of two people who have established, between them, something that has no clear category and who are now in the practical business of determining what to do with it. "I wanted to say," he began, "that I understand if you feel this, that what I proposed was." "I told you I needed time," she said. "I meant it. I am not in the habit of saying things I do not mean." "No," he said, "I know you are not." "Then let us proceed on that basis," she said. You said you would come back. You have come back. I have not yet formed a definitive view. I imagine this will take some time. In the interim, she paused. In the interim, I would rather we talked. If you can do that without requiring me to be further along in my thinking than I am. Yes, he said. Good, she said. She picked up the coat she had been working on when he arrived. You may talk while I work if that is not objectionable. I cannot sit idle and think clearly simultaneously. It is not objectionable at all, he said. And so they talked. About what on that first day I cannot tell you precisely, because I was not there and James was never entirely precise about February in the way he was about October and December. What he told me when he spoke of it at all was that the conversation that day was about the estate, not because he had planned to talk about the estate, but because she asked him a question about the lease dispute with the tenant farmer, which he had apparently mentioned in passing during one of their gallery conversations, and he found himself explaining the terms of the lease in some detail, and she asked 3 questions that were genuinely useful. And by the end of the conversation, he had a clearer view of the solution than he had reached in 3 weeks of thinking about it alone. He came back on the 11th, and the 18th, and the 25th, and the 1st of March, and every Thursday thereafter through the spring. On the 4th of March, she said, You have been coming every Thursday. Yes, he said. That is quite regular, she said. I had noticed, he agreed. I am not, she said carefully, drawing any particular conclusion from it. Nor am I, he said, with the slight gravity that was his version of humor. She looked at him from over the piece of work she was doing, then a very small smile. I have a commission due on Friday, she said. I may need to work late on Thursday. I can come Wednesday, he said. Wednesday is also acceptable, she said, and went back to the commission. He came Wednesday, and the following Wednesday, and for the rest of March, twice weekly rather than once, without either of them having formally renegotiated any terms. There is a conversation from April that I will tell you in full, because I was present for it. The only time, in those months on Milsom Lane, that I was present for one of their conversations rather than hearing about it after the fact. I had gone with James on what he described as a social call, and what I suspected was an exercise in witnesses, or perhaps in shared experience, or perhaps simply a desire to have me there. Because there are moments when the presence of an old friend matters in a way that is not about need exactly, but about something like gravity. Verity's assistant let us in. Verity was in the back workroom examining a length of amber cloth against the window light. She looked at James, and then at me with the assessing expression that I had decided was simply the way she saw. 2 of you today, she said. Lord Ware was passing, James said. Lord Ware was not passing, she said. Lord Ware lives in Derbyshire, she looked at me. You have come to observe. I have come to visit, I said, which is not quite the same thing. It is almost quite the same thing, she said, not unkindly. Sit down, both of you, I'll have Jenny fetch tea. We sat. The workroom had, over the months, acquired a particular quality that I noticed every time I came into it. A quality of organized energy, things in use rather than stored, the feeling of a place where work was actually done rather than prepared for. There were papers on the table beside the commission book, in Verity's precise hand, that turned out to be calculations for an order of fabric from a supplier in London. There was a length of a dark green wool draped over the dress form that she was apparently trying against some design concept she had in mind. There was a small jar of early spring flowers on the windowsill, which was new. James noticed the flowers at the same moment I did. From the market, she said, without looking up from the amber cloth. The woman who sells them gives me the ones that are slightly past their best for half price. They are perfectly fine. Slightly past their best, James said. Yes, she said. They still have several days, and half price is half price. He looked at the flowers for a moment. I saw the expression on his face, then he looked away. We drank tea. Verity and James talked about the commission she was finishing, and then about a problem he was having with a section of the home farm drainage that was not performing as the plan had indicated it should, and she asked 2 questions, and he answered them, and she said, The plan was designed for a soil that is not quite what you have. The soil on that section will hold water differently than the plan accounts for. She paused. I know nothing about drainage, so I may be entirely wrong. But you might have a surveyor look at the soil composition rather than at the drainage plan. He looked at her. How do you know what soil holds water differently? I grow things, she said. I have a small garden behind the workshop. Plants tell you very quickly what the soil is doing. She set down the amber cloth. It is possible I am seeing a pattern from a different domain than the one you are working in. That is, he said, a remarkably useful observation. Or it is entirely wrong, she said. He had the surveyor look at the soil composition the following week. The soil on that section was, as it turned out, a clay mix that the drainage plan had not accounted for. The problem was addressed. He came back the following Wednesday and told her. The soil, he said. Was it, she said. Yes. She nodded with the satisfied expression of someone whose hypothesis has been borne out, and went back to the commission she was working on. I watched James watch her go back to the commission. And I thought, it is the small things. It is never the large declarations or the dramatic moments. It is the small things, the repair on the banister post, the panel 2 threads off alignment, the soil that holds water differently. It is the noticing repeated that is the substance of what has happened here. She notices everything. And he has discovered, over the course of 11 weeks in the autumn and 3 months of Wednesdays in the spring, that being noticed, truly noticed, without agenda, is the most quietly extraordinary thing that has ever happened to him. May brought the first warm days, the kind that come tentatively to northern England as if testing the welcome before committing. James and Verity had taken to walking on the Wednesdays when the weather permitted, along the river path, or through the old part of the city where the medieval buildings leaned slightly toward each other above the narrow streets, or up to the ridge above Aldenmere where the whole valley was visible. On one of these walks, in the middle of May, they had the conversation that James told me about with the most detail of any from that period, because it was the one where he understood, he said, that he was not waiting for something to begin. He was in the middle of it. It had begun ordinarily enough. They were talking about the city, about the old buildings, about the particular quality of stone in this part of England that made it darker in wet weather and almost gold in sun. And he mentioned that his grandmother had used to describe Aldenmere as a city that showed you different things depending on the weather, and that he had thought as a boy this was something she said to entertain him, and had understood later that she was simply telling him what she had seen. Verity was quiet for a moment. Then, my mother used to say that things show you what they are when they are under stress, fabric under tension, people under difficulty. She said it as a practical observation, not a philosophical one. She was a very practical woman. What did she mean by it practically? He asked. She meant, Verity said, that you cannot know the quality of a thing from its appearance in ordinary circumstances. A weave that looks fine in the bolt may pull badly under tension. A garment that fits well at rest may bind and drag in movement. You have to put stress on it deliberately before you rely on it, or you find out when it fails. She paused. She applied this to everything, people particularly. And have you found it to be accurate? He asked. She was quiet for a few steps. I have found, she said, that it is more accurate than most things I have been told. He was quiet too for a moment. The river path curved, and the old mill came into view on the far bank, its wheels still, and the water low after a dry April. I have not been particularly under stress, he said. Not recently. I have been managing a difficulty, but that is not the same thing. Managing a difficulty is, it is organized. It is something I know how to do. And stress, she said, is something different. Yes, he said. Stress is, what has happened this winter has been the first time in some years that I have found myself in a situation that I could not manage by being organized and correct. He paused. I have not behaved entirely well in it. No, she agreed, you have not. Then, without any particular sharpness, but you behaved honestly at the end. Which is harder in some ways than behaving well at the beginning. He looked at her. Do you mean that as? I mean it as a straightforward observation, she said. Not as comfort, as what I observe. She glanced at him. You did not ask for comfort. No, he said, I did not. Then I will not offer it, she said. What I will offer, since you are apparently sharing things, is that I have also been under stress of a kind. Since January. Not in the way you have been. But the situation has required something of me that I did not entirely expect to be required, which is the ability to hold two contradictory accurate observations at the same time and proceed as if one of them is manageable. "What are the two observations?" he asked. She was quiet for a moment. "The first is that this is not my affair to have wishes in," she said. "That is accurate." "And the second?" "The second," she said, "is that I have them anyway." He did not say anything for a long time. They walked. The river path bent and the mill disappeared behind a stand of willows, and the city was visible ahead of them on its slight rise, the cathedral tower above everything else. "Verity," he said. "I know," she said. "I am not saying it requires action. I am saying it is true. There is a difference." "Yes," he said, "I know there is." They walked back toward the city in a silence that was the companionable kind, the kind that has been earned over many weeks of talking, and when they parted at the corner of Milsom Lane, she said, "Wednesday next." "Wednesday next," he said. And that was that for the time being. I should tell you about the conversation in the third week of May, which happened not on Milsom Lane but at Ravemore Hall, because James had organized a dinner, small, manageable, not a social event, but what he described to me as a practical necessity, at which he needed an extra person, and I had suggested, with what I considered considerable subtlety, that if he were looking for intelligent conversation on a Tuesday evening, he might consider inviting Miss Callum. Given that she was in Aldenmere, and it was a small dinner, he had looked at me with the expression of a man who has been managed and knows it, and has decided to be managed because the management is in his interest. "I can't invite her to dinner," he said. "You can invite her to dinner," I said. "She is a person. You are a person. You have been having dinner with her in the figurative sense since February." "The figurative sense is not the literal one," he said. "No," I agreed, "but you might find the literal one instructive." He invited her. She came. It was in the way of evenings that are arranged with too many purposes, slightly awkward and also entirely not awkward, because Verity was not a person who was awkward in social situations. She was simply herself in social situations, which is either very easy to be around or very difficult, depending on whether you find honesty comfortable. The Dowager was there, which I had anticipated, and the Dowager looked at Verity across the dinner table with the steadiness of a woman conducting a very careful assessment. Afterward, after Verity had departed, in a carriage James had organized without quite acknowledging that it would be needed, the Dowager said to me in the drawing room, "She is very direct." "Yes," I said. "James likes her," the Dowager said. "Yes," I said. "I know he likes her," the Dowager said. "He handed her the salt before she asked for it. He has never in his life anticipated what anyone needed before they asked for it." I said nothing. "She is not," the Dowager said carefully, "what I would have chosen." "No," I said. "I imagine not." "She is also," the Dowager said, with the deliberateness of a woman revising a position, "a great deal better than I had expected." I looked at her. She was looking at the fire. "I will not like it," she said. "If that is what is happening, I will not like it, and I will not pretend to like it, and there are a number of people whose opinion I will have to manage, and it will be very difficult." A pause. "But I am 63 years old, and I have been watching James for 6 years try to be satisfied with what is required of him and fail, quietly, in the way that a man of his quality fails, without complaint, without drama, without anyone being able to point to any particular thing that is wrong. Just slightly less present each year than the year before. As if something was being steadily removed from him." She paused. "I know what the thing is now. It is the belief that someone might see him clearly and still choose to be there." I was quiet. "She sees him clearly," the Dowager said. "I could see that at dinner. She is not dazzled by the title or the estate or any of the things that dazzle people. She is simply paying attention to the actual person." "Yes," I said, "she is." The Dowager was quiet for a long time. The fire burned. Outside, the Aldenmere night was still. "Very well," she said finally. "I will not stand in the way of it, whatever it is." A pause. "That is all I intend to say on the subject." "Thank you," I said. "Don't thank me," she said. "I have not done anything yet. If and when there is something to do, I will do it. In the meantime," she picked up her embroidery, "I am going to sit here and wish that things were otherwise, and then I am going to stop wishing that, because wishing that things were otherwise than they are is a habit I broke 20 years ago, and I see no reason to take it up again." She put her needle into the embroidery with a precision that suggested the argument was concluded. In June, on the 2nd of the month, when Verity came to Ravemore Hall and said yes, James took her hand and said thank you, and she said she had conditions, and he agreed to all of them, including the bread baker on the corner. What I did not tell you, in the version I gave you earlier, is what happened after the conditions were agreed to and before she departed that afternoon. It is a small thing, but it is the kind of small thing that is the whole substance of what I have been trying to describe. James walked her to the door himself, not the servant's entrance, the front door, the door under the portico that looked out over the park and the long drive and the oaks in their June fullness. He opened the door and they stood for a moment on the step in the afternoon light, and she looked out at the park and said quietly, "It has good bones." He looked at the park. "Yes," he said. "I said that in November," she said, "to Lord Ware about the house." "I know," he said. "He told me." She looked at him. "You have been waiting since November." "Since October," he said. The draft." She was quiet for a moment. Then, "You are patient." "I am motivated," he said, "as I have said before." She looked at the park again. "It will be a great deal of work," she said. Not the estate or the household. Those are manageable. I mean the rest of it, the social rest of it, the people who will have opinions, the people who will always have opinions." "Yes," he said. "I am not afraid of it," she said. "I want you to know that I am not afraid of it. I am stating it as a fact about what is ahead." "I know you are not afraid of it," he said. "I have been watching you be unafraid of things for 11 months. She looked at him. Then the real smile, the one that reached all the way up, that I had first seen in the morning room when she told me she had said yes. "You have been watching me for 11 months, she said. "Did you not know?" he said. "I knew," she said. "I simply did not always know whether to mention it." "You can mention it now," he said. "Yes," she said. "I suppose I can." The carriage was brought round. She got into it. He stood at the top of the steps under the portico and watched the carriage go down the drive, and when it had reached the gate and turned onto the Aldenmere Road and was no longer visible, he stood there for another moment, looking at the park in the June light. I was behind him in the entrance hall. I had not intended to be there. I had been coming down from the library and had found myself standing in the hallway watching the whole exchange through the open door, which I will admit was not my finest moment as a man of discretion, but which I find I am not particularly sorry about. He turned and walked back in, and he saw me, and for a moment we simply looked at each other. "Edmund," he said. "James," I said. She said yes, he said. "I know," I said. "She had conditions," he said. "I heard," I said. He looked at me with the expression of a man who has arrived somewhere and knows it, and does not have words large enough for the fact of it, and has decided not to insult the fact by trying. "Come and have a drink," he said. "Yes," I said. "I think we should." We went to the library, and we poured 2 glasses of the Ravemore brandy that had not changed in 40 years, and we sat on either side of the fire, and I raised my glass, and he raised his, and neither of us said anything, because there was nothing to say that would not be smaller than the moment, and we were both old enough to know when silence was the correct choice. We drank our brandy. The fire burned. Outside, the June light lay long and golden across the park. Ravemore Hall was quiet for the last time. I want to tell you about the first winter. The first winter at Ravemore Hall after the September wedding was not, as I had half expected, in the way you expect things that have been built through difficulty to have a period of settling. It was not difficult. It was surprising in its ease, which is perhaps the most accurate thing I can say about it. Not because nothing was hard. Some things were quite hard. But the hard things were external in the way of weather. You dressed for them, you moved through them, and the house they came home to was not the source of the difficulty. I was there for a portion of the autumn, and then I came back in December, and then again for Christmas. Each time I came, I noticed things. The first thing I noticed was that the gallery was being used. Not in the careful, purposeful way it had been used when Verity was laying out the trousseau. Those had been the movements of a professional in a borrowed space. It was being used in the way a room is used when it belongs to the people who walk through it. There were books on the window seat that had been left there between readings. There was a plant on one of the windowsill ledges that Verity had brought from her workshop garden on Milsom Lane. a small but determined thing that turned out to be a variety of rosemary that had particular meaning for her because her mother had grown it. It sat on the windowsill of the long gallery and was there every time I came, growing progressively less tentative. The second thing I noticed was the way the upper servants were. Mrs. Darrow, who had liked Verity since October, and who had spent the year between January and September conducting herself with the exact neutrality of a woman who has formed a firm view and considers it not her place to share it, was, by November, quite simply glad, in the unguarded way of people who have been in a household long enough to care about the household's well-being as a thing in itself. She managed the transition of the household with the efficiency I would have expected, and with, beneath the efficiency, a quality of satisfaction. The footmen were comfortable. The cook, who had been at the hall since James's father's time, and who was not easily won, spoke well of the new Duchess on the basis of a conversation they had had in the first week about the kitchen garden, during which Verity had apparently asked 6 intelligent questions, and listened to the answers without offering opinions she had not been asked for, which the cook found extraordinary and admirable. The third thing I noticed was James. He was sleeping. I know this because the gallery was no longer audible at 2 in the morning, because the particular quality of a man who has not been sleeping was entirely absent from his face at breakfast, and because he told me once, without making a great deal of it, that he had not slept as well in some years. He said it in the way you say things that are true, but that you do not want to make too much of, because making too much of them seems ungrateful to the thing that has made them possible. In November, at a dinner at which I was present, a conversation arose about the estate's southern fields, which had been underperforming for 3 seasons, and which James's land steward had been at a loss to account for. James was explaining the problem, the yield decline, the various interventions attempted and their results, the steward's current theory about drainage, and Verity, who had been listening with the particular quality of attention she brought to everything, said, "The crop rotation." James looked at her. "I may be wrong," she said, with the air of someone who knows she may be wrong but thinks she probably is not. "I grow things in a small way, and I have been reading. I have an interest in the management of growing things. It is parallel to what I do with materials, the same principles of understanding what a thing needs rather than imposing what you assume it needs. The rotation your steward described is not giving the southern field what it wants. That soil, from what you have said about its composition, wants a different cycle." "A different cycle," James said. "A legume year," she said. "Every other rather than every third. The soil in that section needs more nitrogen than the current rotation provides." A silence at the table. The land steward, who had joined the dinner as he sometimes did, looked at the Duchess with an expression that I read as professional interest overcoming initial skepticism. "I could be entirely wrong," she said again. "I am reasoning by analogy from a much smaller context than your southern fields, but I would ask the question of someone who knows the soil." James looked at the steward. The steward said he would inquire. He did, the following week, of an agricultural consultant who had been working with several estates in the county. The consultant's assessment confirmed, with only minor adjustments, Verity's hypothesis. The southern fields were put on a legume rotation the following spring. By autumn, the yield was the best it had been in 6 years. The land steward never quite recovered from this, in the sense that he thereafter treated the Duchess with a wariness that was entirely respectful and entirely genuine, and consulted her on 3 further occasions in the following 2 years, each time with results that he found disconcerting in their accuracy. The first year also contained the social campaign, which I will describe briefly because it is part of the record, and because Verity's approach to it was, as with most things Verity did, precisely calibrated and unexpectedly effective. She knew, going into it, that there were people who would not receive her. She knew there were people who would receive her with a warmth that was performance, and people who would receive her with a coldness that was performance, and people who would receive her with genuine warmth that they would moderate by the awareness of what receiving her too warmly might cost them, and people who simply would not know what to make of her at all, and would respond to this uncertainty by being awkward. She assessed these categories in advance, categorically, without sentimentality, and she moved through the social season with the same principle she applied to everything. The person who wears the thing is more important than the people watching. She was not trying to win anyone over. She was, as far as I could observe, simply being present at the occasions that required her presence and being herself at those occasions, and trusting that what she was would demonstrate itself adequately over time. This approach alarmed James slightly. He had a sense of what the stakes were, and a natural inclination to manage them, and he found her equanimity about the managing slightly vertiginous. And it alarmed the Dowager considerably more, because the Dowager's strategy would have been a more active one. But neither of them interfered, because they had both understood by this point that interfering with Verity's approach to a problem, when she had formed a view about how it was best addressed, produced excellent argument and no practical change. What happened was this. By the end of the first year, the people who had decided to receive her had done so, and those people included enough of the county that the social picture was manageable. Several of them had received her because of what she was in conversation, direct, genuinely curious, possessed of opinions that were not rehearsed, and interested in other people's actual thoughts rather than their public positions. A few had received her because they saw what the household had become and found themselves, against their expectations, approving of it. And a very few, the Dowager's age mostly, had received her because they had been waiting their whole lives for a Duchess of Ravemore who noticed that the pointing on the east wall of the stable block needed attention and said so. The Dowager, by the spring of the second year, had moved from the position of not standing in the way of it to the more active position of having a considerable regard for her daughter-in-law, which she expressed in the Dowager's way, not effusively, but precisely and without qualification, which was far more convincing. In the third year of the marriage, a Tuesday in November, I came to the hall for a week that was ostensibly about some business between my Derbyshire estate and a connection of James's who was involved in a canal venture of mutual interest, but which was, in practice, simply a week of being in the company of people I found good to be with. On the Wednesday of that week, James and I rode out in the morning over the home farm, which had been expanded by the acquisition of the neighboring 30 acres the previous spring. It was a cold, clear morning, the kind that has a specific quality of light in November, thin and exact, making everything look a little more precisely itself than usual. We rode along the boundary of the new 30 acres, and James explained what he intended to do with it, and I listened, and it was one of those conversations where you are hearing someone describe not just a plan, but a relationship with a piece of land. The kind of relationship you develop when you have cared about a place long enough to know what it needs. She thinks the lower section should be permanent pasture, he said, of the boggy southern corner of the new acquisition. Does she? I said. She walked it last week with the steward, he said. She said the soil in the lower section will always work against cultivation. You would spend more trying to improve it than the improvement would earn, but it would hold sheep well, and the sheep would improve the soil over time at no additional cost, and the wool has a reasonable market. He paused. She is probably right. She usually is, I said. He was quiet for a moment, looking at the lower section in question, boggy, as advertised, a slight depression in the landscape that collected water after rain. She is, he agreed, not in all things. We disagree on a considerable number of things. Yes, I said, I have heard some of them from the corridor. He gave me a brief look. We disagree well, he said, with a precision that meant something. Yes, I said, you do. We turned the horses back toward the hall. The morning light was shifting, the thin November sun moving behind some cloud, and the park darkened slightly, the oaks going from amber to brown, the frost on the grass more visible in the shade. Edmund, he said. James, I said. I want to tell you something. Tell me, I said. I have thought since January last year a good deal about what I did to Lady Cecilia, the cost of it. He was looking ahead, not at me. I have thought about whether it was, he stopped. I have thought about the right thing, whether what I did was the right thing. I was quiet. I do not think, he said slowly, that there is a clean answer to that. I think that what I did to Lady Cecilia was not the right thing. I should have known sooner, and I should have acted on what I knew sooner, and the fact that I did not is mine to own, and I own it. He paused. And I also think, and this is the part that is harder to say, because it requires acknowledging that I benefited from having behaved badly, I also think that what came of it is the most important thing in my life. And I do not know quite how to hold both of those things at once. I considered this for a moment. I think, I said carefully, that holding them both at once is the honest thing. Tidying it into a simple story, either it was worth it, or I was wrong, would be the kind of accuracy that misses something. Yes, he said, yes, I think so. And Lady Cecilia, I said, is, as I may have mentioned, extremely well, and married to someone who anticipates her needs without being asked, and appears to have no difficulty with that, and for whom it appears to be both effortless and genuine. Yes, he said, I know, he paused, I am glad. I know you are, I said. We rode in silence for a while. The hall came into view on its slight rise above the park, the stone warm-colored even in the gray November light, the smoke from the kitchen chimneys going straight up in the still air. She is the most interesting person I have ever known, he said of his wife. Not ardently, exactly. Yes, I said, she is. She told me last week, he said, that the rosemary on the gallery windowsill is the descendant of a cutting her mother took from a plant she grew from seed 30 years ago, and that the plant itself was a cutting from something her grandmother brought from a village in the north when she married. 4 generations of the same plant. And I said, and she said, it does not look like much, but it has been somewhere important to a great many women who deserved somewhere important, and she intends to take a cutting when it is ready and start the next generation. I looked at him. She was talking about the rosemary, he said. Yes, I said, she was. He looked at the hall ahead of us. I think, he said, it will be a good house for a cutting to be started in. I did not say anything, because he did not need me to say anything, because what he had said was perfectly accurate and complete, and adding to it would only have reduced it. We rode the last stretch to the stable yard in the still November air, and the hall porter opened the doors as we came in, and from somewhere inside the house, the kitchen corridor, the sound carrying cleanly in the quiet, there was the sound of Verity in discussion with someone about something, her voice clear and direct and unhurried, entirely at home. The house on the hill above Aldenmere was not quiet. It had not been quiet for 2 years. It would not be quiet again. 30 years is a long time to know something. Long enough that the knowing becomes part of the structure of things, load-bearing in its own right, and you can no longer quite remember what the structure was like before it bore that load. I am old now as I write this. James is old. Verity is old, which she finds neither alarming nor dignified but simply accurate, and addresses with the same principle she applies to everything. You notice what is true and you work with it rather than against it, and you do not waste time being surprised by what you knew was coming. The children are in middle life, their own children beginning to be old enough to hold opinions that are uncomfortably well-reasoned. The hall has had 3 sets of improvements in 30 years. The kitchen wing, the drainage across the entire home farm, and a section of the gallery that turned out to have the dry rot behind the plaster that the panel separation had been warning about for decades. And it is in better condition than it was when James came into it, which is not always the case with large old buildings, and is, in part, a tribute to a woman who notices what is about to need attention and says so before it is urgent. The rosemary is still on the gallery windowsill. It has been repotted 3 times. There are cuttings of it in the garden on Milsom Lane. The workshop is still there, considerably expanded, and run now by a woman who trained under Verity and who is, by all accounts, extraordinary. There are cuttings in the garden of the daughter's house in Northumberland, and one in a pot in the eldest son's study in London, and one in my own house in Derbyshire that Verity sent me the winter after my wife died, because she understood, without my saying it, that I would want something living in the rooms. That is the kind of person she is, has always been, will always be, I imagine, the kind of person who notices before you ask what something needs. I was at the hall last autumn, which is when I began writing this, because James found me standing in the long gallery one afternoon looking at the rosemary on the windowsill, and the park beyond the window and the light that was the October light, amber and exact. The same light that was there 30 years ago when a woman arrived at the servants' entrance with a leather satchel and a measuring tape and told the Duke of Ravemore to close the door. "What are you writing?" he asked. "Your story," I said. He was quiet for a moment. Then, "It is not only my story." "No," I said, "it is not, but it begins with you." He looked at the park. The oaks were the same oaks, older, larger, but the same ones, doing what oaks do, which is persist through everything with a stolid magnificence that has nothing to do with drama. "Begin with her," he said. "It begins with her." All right, I said, I will. I have tried to do that in this account. I have tried to begin with her, or as close to her beginning in this story as I was present for. I have tried to tell the whole of it honestly, without compression, and without the tidying that makes stories easier to tell and less true to live. I have tried to give you the small things, the repair on the banister post, the draft from the hall, the panel 2 threads off alignment, the soil that holds water differently, the rosemary on the windowsill, because the small things are the story. The large moment on the January morning was only possible because of 11 weeks of small things that accumulated into something too true to override. She noticed his house was lonely. She noticed what it was made of and what it was missing. She said so, with the same directness she brought to a hem that was going to pull or a seam that would give under stress, because she had no way to be anything other than honest about what she saw. And what she saw was a house with very good bones, and a man inside it who had been managing everything correctly for long enough that he had nearly forgotten that correct is not the same as true. He noticed, across 11 weeks of trying not to, that she was the truest thing he had encountered. And then he closed a door against a draft, and found a reason to walk through the long gallery, and stood in a doorway 6 times in 3 weeks because the light was on, and lay awake in December thinking about a sentence she had said without knowing she was saying it, and sat in the dark on the eve of a wedding knowing there was a mistake he could still not fix, but one that he could stop from becoming permanent, and rode through ice on a January morning, because the only honest direction was toward a workshop on Milsom Lane. He has been riding in that direction for 30 years. The house is not quiet. That is the story. I want to tell you also about the first argument. Every long account of a marriage tends to skip the arguments, as if they are the interruptions to the story rather than part of it. I have been guilty of this already. I have described James and Verity as people who argued well and disagreed productively, and both of these things are true. But I have not described the first real argument, which happened in October of the first year and which I witnessed, and which was the moment I understood something about the nature of their particular arrangement that I had not quite understood before. It was over the management of the workshop. Verity had, as agreed, continued running Callum on Milsom Lane after the wedding. She had brought on a second assistant, the young woman who was eventually to take over the business, and had reorganized the commission book to accommodate the fact that she could no longer be present every day. She was there 3 mornings a week, and the remainder was managed in her absence, and this arrangement was working well. She had been very clear about this as a condition of the marriage, and James had agreed to it without hesitation. What he had not, apparently, fully processed was the specific weekly arrangement, which meant that Verity was at the workshop on Monday, Tuesday, and Thursday mornings, which were also 3 of the mornings when James was typically in the estate office for meetings with the land steward or the solicitor, or the various people who had business with a large country estate. The result was that on those 3 mornings, 2 people who lived in the same house were not in the same house, and this was fine on Monday and Tuesday but became apparent as a problem on Thursday because Thursday was the day when the weekly household meeting was held. A long-standing Ravemore tradition involving James, Mrs. Darrow, the cook, and the head groom, and Verity was not present for it. James mentioned this in October, in the way he mentioned things that were bothering him, which was not by saying they were bothering him, but by raising a practical problem and asking what might be done about it. The Thursday meeting, he said, at dinner on a Wednesday, would benefit from your view on the kitchen garden allocations for the winter. I am at the workshop on Thursday mornings, she said. I know, he said. I was wondering whether the arrangement might be adjusted. A pause, the workshop arrangement, she said. Just for Thursdays, he said. The meeting is at 9. You might come to the meeting and then go to the workshop afterward. She looked at him across the dinner table. I was at the other end of the table, attending to my food with the slightly artificial focus of a man who is listening to the conversation he is not supposed to be listening to. The workshop arrangement, she said again carefully, was an agreed condition. Yes, he said. I am not suggesting changing the arrangement. I am suggesting adjusting the timing on Thursdays. The timing is the arrangement, she said. I go on Monday, Tuesday, and Thursday mornings because those are the mornings that work for the workshop's requirements. If I move Thursday to the afternoon is occupied with different work, and the commissions that require morning light are not done. Surely the assistant can. The assistant, she said, with the precision of someone who is keeping their voice very even, is not me. That is the entire point of the assistant. She is excellent and she is learning, but there are judgments I make in the morning that require my eye, and I go in the morning because that is when those judgments need to be made. James was quiet for a moment. The household meeting. I will attend the household meeting, she said. When I am not at the workshop, I will contribute to the kitchen garden allocations on another day. What I will not do is rearrange the workshop schedule to suit a meeting time that was established before I was part of this household, and that could perfectly easily be moved to the afternoon. A silence. The meeting has been on Thursday morning since my grandfather's time, James said. Yes, she said, and I am sure it has served your grandfather and your father very well. It can be on Thursday afternoons and serve you equally well. I took a very careful bite of my dinner. I agreed, James said, with a precision that indicated we had now arrived at the part of the argument that was actually the argument, that the workshop would continue. I did not agree that the workshop would take priority over household arrangements. You agreed, she said, with an equal precision, that I would not be required to perform a version of myself that was not myself. The version of myself that abandons the workshop's requirements because a meeting time is inconvenient is not myself. It is a version of the previous arrangement, adjusted for the presence of a wife who agreed to conditions that are apparently now being renegotiated. A silence longer than the previous ones. I am not renegotiating the conditions, he said. That is what renegotiating the conditions looks like, she said, from where I am sitting. Another silence. I finished my dinner. The footman appeared to clear. I thanked him. Neither James nor Verity appeared to notice. The meeting, James said finally, can be moved to Thursday afternoons. Thank you, she said. I should have suggested that to begin with, he said. Yes, she said, you should have. Another silence. Then, from James, with the slight softness that was his version of having said something he wanted to say, I apologize. She looked at him across the table. The precision in her face, which had been the precision of someone defending something real, shifted slightly. Thank you, she said more gently. I did not want to have that argument. Nor did I, he said. I was not thinking clearly about what I was asking. You were thinking about the Thursday meeting, she said, which is reasonable. I am asking you, in future, to think about it more carefully before you ask me to adjust for it. I will, he said. The footman came back in. The dinner proceeded. And what I had understood by the end of it was this. They had had a real argument, with a real point of genuine conflict. Not a manufactured disagreement, not a misunderstanding, but a place where his habits and her conditions ran directly against each other. And they had moved through it and arrived somewhere that was actually better than where they had started, with a meeting time that made more sense than the traditional one, and an understanding between them that was slightly more precisely calibrated than it had been before the argument. This, I thought, is what disagreeing well looks like. Not the absence of friction, the presence of friction that produces better fit. I should also tell you about the Thursday meeting in its new form, because it became one of the things I always looked forward to when I was at the hall, for reasons that were not about the household management itself, but about what it showed. The Thursday meeting in its new Thursday afternoon form was chaired by James and attended by Mrs. Darrow, the cook, the head groom, and when she was available, Verity. I say when she was available because she was not always back from the workshop by 2 o'clock, and on those occasions the meeting proceeded without her, which was fine. On the occasions when she was there, however, the meeting had a quality that it had apparently not had in its Thursday morning version. What she contributed was specific and practical. Questions about the kitchen garden that connected to questions about the home farm that connected to questions about the estate management in ways that the individual people present had not previously connected them. The cook knew what grew well. Verity knew something about soil conditions and what affected yield. James knew the farm accounts. Mrs. Darrow knew the household consumption. In separate conversations, these produced adequate decisions. In the same room, with Verity asking the questions that connected them, they produced better decisions. The head groom was the last to come around, which I found entertaining. He was a man of very fixed views and considerable expertise, and a slight tendency to regard the Duchess as a person who was interested in the horses in the abstract and therefore manageable. The Thursday meeting in November of the first year contained a discussion about the winter fodder allocation for the stables, which the head groom had presented in the usual way, and Verity had asked a question about the hay quality from the eastern field versus the northern, and the head groom had explained that the eastern field was the better quality, and she had asked why it was being allocated second if it was the better quality. And the head groom had said that it was allocated second because the stable schedule put the working horses first and the carriage horses second, and she had asked why the working horses were not given the better quality if the working horses were the ones doing the more demanding work. And the head groom had looked at her with the expression of a man for whom this had never before been a question. The hay allocation was adjusted. The head groom never quite fully recovered from the experience of having the hay allocation adjusted, but he told Mrs. Darrow in the spring that the working horses' condition had improved over the winter. And I was told about this by Mrs. Darrow, who told me with the understated satisfaction of someone who had formed a view about the Duchess in October of the previous year, and who was pleased to see it borne out. I should tell you about the spring of the third year, when the eldest child was born. James told me about it in a letter that arrived on a Wednesday morning in April, which I have kept and can quote precisely. He wrote, "Edmund. A son, he arrived this morning, and he is well, and she is well, and I have just come from her room, and I find I need to sit down for a moment, but also to tell someone, and you are the person I tell things to. She is eating toast. The boy is very loud for someone of such recent origin. I believe he has her eyes, though she says it is too soon to know. I am going to go back in a moment, but I wanted you to know first." I read that letter 4 times when it arrived, and then I folded it and put it in the inner pocket of my coat. And I sat in my library in Derbyshire for about 10 minutes feeling the particular feeling you feel when something has gone exactly as well as it possibly could for someone you care about, which is a kind of gladness that has nothing of envy in it, and everything of the recognition that the world is, on this occasion, correctly arranged. I wrote back, "James, congratulations, go back in, write to me when you have slept, Edmund." I went to the hall 3 weeks later, when the household was in the particular pleased disarray of a house where something important has just happened and not quite settled yet. The son, who was named, with a predictability I found endearing, Thomas, after James's father, was installed in the nursery under the supervision of an experienced nurse who had been engaged on Verity's recommendation. Verity was in the library when I arrived, reading, with Thomas in a cradle beside her that she pushed gently from time to time with one foot without looking up from the page. "Edmund," she said when I came in. "Congratulations," I said. She looked at the cradle. "Thank you," she said, the real smile. "He is very loud." "James mentioned that in the letter," I said. "He mentioned it in the letter," she said, with the particular dryness she reserved for James's correspondence, "and has also mentioned it on every occasion since, as if the volume of an infant is a phenomenon that requires ongoing documentation." "He is a thorough man," I said. "He is," she agreed, not without fondness. I sat down. Thomas chose this moment to demonstrate the property James had documented, briefly and with conviction. Verity looked down at him, in the cradle, with an expression I have not previously seen on her face and do not have words for that are adequate to it, something that was beyond the professional, beyond the careful, beyond the precise. Something that was simply entirely, without any governance at all, love. She reached into the cradle and adjusted the blanket with the same small, careful movement she brought to a hem or a seam, ensuring the fit, ensuring the warmth, ensuring that what was there was what was needed. Then she went back to her book. James came in 20 minutes later, with the expression of a man who has just come from wherever he had been and whose first act on arriving anywhere is to check that his wife and his son are in the same room. He looked at Verity, and then at Thomas, and then at me, and he said, "Edmund, good, you came." "You told me in the letter," I said. "I know," he said. He sat down in the chair across from Verity. He picked up a book. He did not read it, because he was looking at Verity and Thomas, alternatively, with the steady attention of a man cataloging something he intends to remember. "James," Verity said, without looking up from her page. "Yes," he said. "Stop looking at us and read something," she said. "We are perfectly well. We were perfectly well 10 minutes ago, and we will be perfectly well in 10 minutes' time." "I know," he said. "Then read something," she said. He opened his book. He did not read it. She knew he did not read it because she looked up from her page after a moment and saw him still looking at her. She looked back at him for a moment with a particular expression that was not the assessing look, and not the professional look, and not the serious argument look, and not even the real smile. An expression I had not seen on her face before, which was something like yielding, and something like being seen, and something like the recognition of a thing that is simply, entirely, without question, right. Then she went back to her book. He went back to his. Thomas slipped. I sat in the library of Ravemore Hall and looked at the two of them on either side of the cradle, reading in the afternoon light, and I thought about October 1821, when I stood in this same room and James stood at the window looking at the park, and told me what he wanted, in the careful, pained way of a man who has not yet allowed himself to want things. And what he had said, I want to be in a house that is not quiet. I want to speak to someone who says what they actually mean. I want there to be a person in this house who thinks about the person who wears the things rather than the things themselves, was sitting 6 feet from him in a chair, reading a book about soil chemistry, with her foot resting lightly against the cradle rocker. 30 years later, she is still in the chair. The book has changed. The cradle is long since gone. The grandchildren are in the library in the evenings sometimes, conducting their complicated floor games, and there is a rosemary plant on the windowsill that has been there in various iterations since the first year of the marriage. The house on the hill above Aldenmere is, by every measure I know, exactly what a house with very good bones and the right arrangement of circumstances can become. Which is to say, it is full. Which is to say, it is warm. Which is to say, it is not and has not been for 30 years quiet. I have one more thing to tell you, which is smaller than the others and perhaps the most true. It was a January evening, the 14th of January, the anniversary, as both James and Verity were always aware, though they did not make a ceremony of it. On the 15th anniversary, which fell on a Sunday, I happened to be at the hall, and I happened to be in the library in the late afternoon when James came in from outside with the cold still on his coat, having apparently been for a walk in the park, and he came over to the fire and said, without any particular preamble, 15 years. I looked up from what I was reading. Yes, I said. She sent me out, he said. She said I was standing in the kitchen being underfoot and that I should go for a walk and come back when I had given the cook 30 minutes to manage without me. Were you being underfoot? I said. Yes, he said. I was trying to help with the dinner preparation. He paused. I was not helping. Were you aware of not helping? Not initially, he said. She made it clear. He sat down in the chair across from me and extended his hands toward the fire. He had the expression of a man who is not at all unhappy about having been sent out of the kitchen, who finds the being sent out of the kitchen to be evidence of a state of affairs that he is deeply and permanently glad to be in. 15 years, he said again. What are you thinking? I said. He was quiet for a moment. Then, I am thinking about a door, he said. The morning room, October. She told me to close it because the draft was disturbing the silk. I know, I said. You have thought about that door for 15 years. I closed it, he said. I closed the door and went to find you, and you were in the library, and I came in and sat down and did not say anything for a while, and I was thinking, even then, I was already thinking something I could not name yet. He paused. I had known her for perhaps 3 minutes. And you closed the door, I said. And I closed the door, he said, because she asked me to, because she needed the draft addressed so the silk would lie correctly, and I was the source of the draft, and the most useful thing I could do was close the door. He looked at the fire. I have thought many times since that it was the most precisely correct thing I ever did in my life. Closing that door. You were not doing it for the right reasons at the time, I said. You were doing it because a working professional had made a reasonable request. Yes, he said, but the right action does not always require the right understanding at the time it is taken. Sometimes you do the right thing before you understand why it is right. He paused. I closed the door, and then I walked past the gallery for 3 months and stood in doorways and looked at what was happening in the room beyond, and eventually I had enough of standing in doorways. You did, I said. Edmund, he said, thank you. I looked at him. For what specifically? For going to Milsom Lane, he said, in January. I know I said at the time that you should not have, and I know you know I did not mean it, but I have wanted to say properly for 15 years that what you went there and did was, It was the thing that made it possible for me to go. Knowing that she had said, it was a house I was glad to work in. Knowing that the thing I felt was not a thing I had manufactured from desperation. Knowing it was real. I was quiet for a moment. She would have told you herself, I said. Eventually. Perhaps, he said, but not in time. The timing mattered. The timing, I agreed, mattered. He looked at the fire. She has made something very different of my life than what it would have been, he said. Not easier necessarily. She is not an easy person, and she would be the first to tell you so. I know, I said. But different in every way that makes the difference between a life that works and a life that is lived. He paused. I do not know how to say that more precisely than that. That is precisely enough, I said. He was quiet. From somewhere in the direction of the kitchen, there was the sound of the household in dinner preparation, the particular organized energy of a house that does a thing well. The cook's voice, and another voice answering, and the sound of something being set down on a stone surface, and then the distant specific sound of Verity saying something that I could not quite hear from the library, in the even, clear voice that had not changed in 15 years. James listened. His face in the firelight had the expression I had seen on the morning of the September wedding, and had been seeing, in various forms, for 15 years. The expression of a man who is exactly where he intended to be. I should go back in, he said. Yes, I said. I told her I would give the cook 30 minutes. It has been 35, I said. He stood up. He looked at me for a moment with the slight, precise warmth that was all he had ever needed to convey what he meant. Thank you, he said again, for all of it. Go back in, I said. You are being missed. He went. I sat in the library and listened to the sound of the house, the kitchen, the dinner preparation, and then a moment later the particular shift in the texture of the sound as James rejoined it, and the voice that answered his and the conversation that began. The house was not quiet. It has not been quiet for 30 years. That is the whole of it. That is the story of the Duke who left his fiancée at the altar and rode through the storm to find the seamstress, though I have always felt that title gets the emphasis slightly wrong, because the riding through the storm was the last act of a thing that had been building for 11 weeks, and the real story is not the storm ride but all the small things before it. The door, the draft, the panel 2 threads off alignment, the repair on the banister post, the pointing on the east wall of the stable, the sentence about a lonely house that was said without knowing it was being heard, the sentence about a house that might change. And the 6 weeks of December, midnight gallery conversations that were not quite conversations and not quite declarations, and not quite anything except the truth accumulating, as truth does, until it cannot be held any longer. She noticed, he noticed that she noticed, and then, eventually, he did something about it. The rest, as I have said, belongs to them. I am Lord Edmund Ware, and I have been telling this story for 30 years, badly in fragments to people who asked and people who did not. And I have finally, sitting in the library at Ravemore Hall in the autumn light, with the rosemary on the windowsill and the sound of the household in dinner preparation, and the grandchildren somewhere in the upper floors being told, by their grandmother, to mind the pinboard, I have finally told it completely. I am aware that I have gone on at considerable length. But it is a considerable story. And it was a considerable door.